Story 1. The Repeating Mile Marker. Jake Patterson had been driving the I-80 corridor between Omaha and Des Moines for 17 years. He knew every truck stop, every speed trap, and every mile marker along that stretch of asphalt like he knew the lines on his own hands. On the night of March 14, 2019, that familiarity would become his prison. He'd left the Flying J in Council Bluffs at 11:47 p.m., right on schedule. The load was nothing special, agricultural equipment headed to a distributor in Iowa City. His Freightliner Cascadia hummed steadily at 65 miles per hour, and the CB radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter between drivers fighting sleep and boredom. The moon hung full and bright overhead, casting long shadows across the empty farmland that stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway. Mile marker 23 passed on his right. Jake barely registered it, his mind already calculating fuel consumption and arrival times. His coffee sat in the cup holder, still warm from the last stop. The digital clock on his dashboard read 12:03 a.m. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Then he saw mile marker 23 again. At first, he thought he'd misread it. Maybe it was 32 or 25 and his tired eyes had played tricks on him. But as the green reflective sign passed under his headlights, there was no mistaking it. Mile marker 23. His GPS showed him at mile marker 28, but the physical marker clearly displayed 23. Jake rubbed his eyes and checked his speedometer. Still 65. He hadn't slowed down or turned around. Probably some kids messing around, switching signs, he muttered to himself, though he couldn't remember ever hearing about anyone doing that on this stretch. The highway stretched straight ahead, no curves, no turns, just the endless ribbon of concrete dividing the dark fields. 5 minutes later, mile marker 23 appeared again. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His GPS now showed mile marker 33, but there it was again. The same green sign with the number 23 in bold white letters. He grabbed his CB radio. "Hey, any drivers heading eastbound on 80 near Council Bluffs? This is the red Cascadia, you got your ears on." Static answered him. Then a voice crackled through, distant and distorted. "This is Big Ben, I'm about 40 miles east of you, partner. What's your 20? I'm supposed to be around mile marker 33, but I keep seeing marker 23. You seeing anything weird out there?" A long pause followed. "Can't say I am, friend. You feeling all right? Maybe pull over and grab some rest." Jake wanted to argue, but what could he say? That the highway was stuck in a loop. That made no sense. "Yeah, maybe you're right. Thanks, Big Ben." But he didn't pull over. Something told him that stopping would be worse. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, watching for anything unusual. The farmland looked the same, dark soil, occasional clusters of trees, distant farmhouse lights that glowed like fireflies in the blackness. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. His odometer was ticking upward normally. Mile marker 23 passed again. Now panic began to seep into Jake's chest like cold water. He looked at his phone. 12:47 a.m. He'd been driving for exactly 1 hour, and according to his GPS, he should be near mile marker 60. But the physical markers told a different story. He'd passed marker 23 at least 6 times now. The same marker. The same slight bend in the post. The same small dent in the reflective surface. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the Cascadia to 75 miles per hour. The engine roared and the white lines on the road blurred beneath him. Maybe if he went faster, he could break through whatever this was. The CB radio erupted with voices suddenly, multiple drivers talking over each other, but the words were garbled like recordings played backward. Jake twisted the knob, trying to find a clear channel, but every frequency carried the same distorted noise. Mile marker 23. Again. "No, no, no," Jake whispered. He'd been driving for 90 minutes now at high speed. He should be near Iowa City, but instead he was trapped in this impossible loop of highway. His fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full. It hadn't moved at all. That wasn't possible. He'd been running hard for an hour and a half. He should have burned at least a quarter tank. The temperature gauge began to climb. Jake watched it creep toward the red zone, but the engine sounded fine. No unusual noises, no loss of power, just the steady growl of the Cummins diesel pulling its load. Outside, the landscape remained unchanged. The same fields, the same distant lights, the same empty highway. Then he saw the headlights behind him. They appeared suddenly in his mirrors, closing fast. Another semi, its lights on high beam, flooding Jake's cab with harsh white light. He couldn't make out the truck's color or model, just those blinding lights getting closer. Jake eased to the right, giving the other driver room to pass, but the truck behind him matched his movements, staying directly on his tail. "Back off, buddy," Jake growled, but his CB was still filled with that awful backward chatter. The truck behind him pulled closer, impossibly close, until Jake couldn't see its front grille anymore, just the glare of its lights. His heart hammered against his ribs. At 75 miles per hour, if that truck tapped him, they'd both go tumbling. Mile marker 23 flashed past. The truck behind him vanished. One moment it was there, filling his mirrors with light, and the next, the highway was empty again. Jake's breath came in short gasps. Sweat ran down his face despite the cab's air conditioning. He grabbed his water bottle with a shaking hand and drank deeply, trying to calm himself. That's when he noticed the people standing along the roadside. They appeared in his headlights one by one, spaced evenly along the shoulder. Men and women in trucker clothing, jeans, flannel shirts, company caps. They stood motionless, facing the highway, their faces pale in the Cascadia's lights. As Jake passed each one, their heads turned to follow his truck, their eyes reflecting his headlights like animal eyes in the dark. He counted 12 of them before mile marker 23 appeared again, and when he looked back, the people were gone. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Hallucinations from fatigue, carbon monoxide leak in the cab, some kind of elaborate prank. But nothing explained the repeating mile marker, the unchanging fuel gauge, the GPS that showed him miles ahead of where the physical sign said he was. He tried his cell phone. No signal. That was odd, this stretch usually had decent coverage. He scrolled through his contacts, found his wife's number, but the call wouldn't connect. Just silence, not even a busy signal or error message. The clock now read 2:15 a.m. He'd been trapped for over 2 hours. Mile marker 23 passed again, and this time Jake saw something different. A truck was parked on the shoulder just ahead, its hazard lights flashing. A Peterbilt older model, dark blue or black in the dim light. A figure stood beside it, waving both arms in the universal sign for help. Every instinct told Jake to keep driving, but something stronger pulled at him. The trucker's code, the unwritten rule that you help a fellow driver in trouble. He began to slow down, his air brakes hissing. As he decelerated, he could see the figure more clearly. A man, probably in his 50s, wearing a worn leather jacket and a baseball cap. Jake's speed dropped to 40, then 30. His right blinker clicked rhythmically as he prepared to pull onto the shoulder. The stranded driver's face became visible in the Cascadia's lights, weathered, tired, grateful. The man smiled and raised a hand in thanks. Then Jake saw the Peterbilt's license plate. Iowa plates, but the numbers made his blood freeze. 232,323. He jammed his foot on the accelerator. The Cascadia lurched forward, engine roaring as it fought to regain speed. In his mirror, he watched the man's smile fade, watched the figure grow smaller as Jake pulled away. The stranded truck and its driver disappeared into the darkness behind him. Mile marker 24 appeared on his right. Jake nearly sobbed with relief. 24, not 23. The next marker was 25, then 26. His GPS and the physical markers finally agreed. The fuel gauge dropped to just under 3/4. The CB radio cleared, carrying normal trucker chatter. His cell phone showed 2 bars of signal. He drove for another 30 minutes, checking his mirrors constantly before he finally pulled into a truck stop near Iowa City. His hands shook as he shut down the engine. The clock read 9:58 a.m. According to his logs, he should have arrived over an hour ago, but he'd lost that time in whatever had happened back there. Jake reported the incident to the Iowa State Police, though he knew how crazy it sounded. They were polite but clearly skeptical. No other drivers reported anything unusual that night. No accidents, no road closures, nothing that could explain his experience. He still drives I-80, but now he plans his routes to avoid that section between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Sometimes late at night, when he passes mile marker 23, he swears he can see that dark Peterbilt on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing and a figure standing beside it, waiting for someone to stop. But Jake never slows down anymore, and he never looks back for too long. Story 2. The convoy to nowhere. Maria Hernandez had been hauling freight for 12 years when she got the call about the special convoy. It came through her dispatcher at 3:00 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2021. The details were simple. Join a 4-truck convoy hauling sealed containers from a warehouse in Elko, Nevada, to a facility in Salt Lake City. The pay was triple her usual rate, and all she had to do was follow the lead truck and keep her CB on Channel 19. She arrived at the Elko warehouse at 7:00 p.m. as instructed. 3 other trucks were already there, 2 Kenworths and another Freightliner like hers. The drivers stood in a loose group near the loading dock. A heavy-set man in his 60s named Ray, a younger guy maybe 30 years old who introduced himself as Cooper, and a woman about Maria's age named Diane. They exchanged the usual pleasantries while warehouse workers used forklifts to load identical white containers onto their trailers. "Anyone know what we're hauling?" Cooper asked, watching the workers secure his load. Ray shrugged. "Above our pay grade, kid. They're paying us to drive, not ask questions." The containers were unmarked except for a series of numbers stenciled in black on each side. Maria noticed they were all padlocked with heavy-duty seals, and the warehouse workers wore gloves when handling them. She de-hauled plenty of sensitive cargo before: electronics, pharmaceuticals, government equipment, but something about these containers felt different. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and up close, they gave off a faint metallic smell that reminded her of pennies. At 8:30 p.m., a man in a dark suit emerged from the warehouse office. He was tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of forgettable face that Maria knew she struggled to describe later. He carried a tablet and checked something on the screen before addressing them. "Thank you all for coming. The route is programmed into your GPS units. You'll notice it's not the standard highway route. We need you to take some back roads for this delivery. Stay together, maintain 15-minute intervals between trucks, and keep your CB radios on Channel 19 at all times. Do not deviate from the route. Do not stop except for emergencies. Do not open the containers. You'll be met at the destination. Any questions?" Maria raised her hand. "What time are we expected?" The man checked his tablet. "Between 4:00 and 5:00 a.m. It's a 7-hour drive with the route we've plotted." Diane frowned. "That's longer than the direct route. Why the back roads?" "Security reasons. The cargo is sensitive." The man's tone made it clear that further questions wouldn't be welcome. He handed each of them an envelope. "Half your payment now, half on delivery. Safe travels." Ray's truck pulled out first at 9:00 p.m., followed by Cooper 15 minutes later, then Diane, and finally Maria at 9:45 p.m. The GPS showed a route that wove through smaller highways and rural roads, avoiding the main interstate. Maria settled into her seat, adjusted her mirrors, and followed the blue line on her screen. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded normally. The route took them through small Nevada towns that were mostly dark at this hour. A few streetlights, closed gas stations, the occasional lit window in a house. Maria's CB crackled periodically with brief exchanges between the other drivers. "This is Ray in the lead truck, Everyone's still with me. Cooper here, about 12 minutes behind you. Diane checking in, all good. Maria bringing up the rear, no problems. But as they pushed deeper into the night and farther from civilization, Maria began to notice oddities. The GPS showed them on State Route 229, but when she looked for road signs, she couldn't find any. The landscape outside her windows grew increasingly unfamiliar. Jagged rock formations that looked almost artificial, stands of dead trees that seemed to lean toward the road, and a sky that remained completely black despite the full moon she'd seen earlier in Elko. At 11:47 p.m., Cooper's voice crackled over the CB, tight with concern. "Hey, is anyone else noticing the lack of signs? I haven't seen a mile marker in over an hour." "Same here," Diane responded. "And I'm not picking up any radio stations, just static." Maria checked her radio. Diane was right. The scan function found nothing but white noise across the entire FM and AM bands. That was unusual but not impossible in remote areas. Still, it added to the growing sense that something was off about this convoy. "Just keep following the GPS," Ray's gravelly voice advised. "We're past the halfway point. Another 3 hours and we're done." But Maria's GPS showed something that made her stomach tighten. According to the screen, they'd been driving for over 3 hours and covered more than 200 miles, yet the battery indicator on her truck showed more charge than when she'd started. Her fuel gauge had barely moved. And the odometer, she'd glanced at it when leaving Elko, showed an increase of only 43 miles. She keyed her CB mic. "Anyone else checking their instruments? Something's not adding up." Silence answered her for several long seconds. Then Diane, "Jesus, you're right. My odometer says I've only gone 51 miles, but the GPS shows 220. "What the hell is going on?" Cooper's voice had risen in pitch. "Ray, talk to us. You're in the lead. What are you seeing?" More silence. Maria watched the dark road ahead, her headlights cutting through the blackness but revealing nothing except more asphalt and the endless barren landscape. The white lines marking the road seemed to glow with their own luminescence, too bright for normal reflective paint. "Ray," Diane tried again. "You there?" Static hissed over the CB, and then Ray's voice emerged, but it sounded strange, distant, and hollow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "The road. There's something wrong with the road." "It's not. It doesn't go anywhere, it just keeps going." "What does that mean?" Maria demanded. "Ray, are you okay? I can see my own taillights ahead of me. That's impossible. I'm following myself. I'm following my own truck." Maria's hands tightened on the wheel. She scanned the road ahead but saw only darkness and the faint glow of Diane's taillights in the distance. "Ray, that's not possible. You're tired. Maybe we should all pull over and—" "No." Ray's voice cracked. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. They're waiting for us to stop." "Who's waiting?" Cooper shouted. "Ray, you're not making sense." The CB went dead. Maria tried to raise Ray again, but he didn't respond. Cooper and Diane called out as well, their voices growing more panicked, but the lead driver remained silent. Maria checked her GPS. It still showed all 4 trucks in convoy, evenly spaced, moving along the blue route line. At 1:13 a.m., Diane screamed. The sound cut through the CB like a knife, a raw shriek of terror that made Maria's blood ice over. "There's something on my trailer. Oh God, there's something crawling on my trailer." Maria grabbed her mic. "Diane, calm down. What do you see?" "In my mirrors, shadows, moving shadows, crawling over the container. They're not human shapes." Diane's breathing came in ragged gasps. "I'm speeding up. I'm getting away from them." "Don't break convoy," Cooper yelled. "The GPS route is specific. If you speed up, you'll—" Diane's truck disappeared from Maria's GPS screen. One moment it was there, a blue dot on the map ahead of her position, and the next, it simply vanished. Maria stared at the screen, then at the road ahead. She should be able to see Diane's taillights in the distance, but the highway stretched empty before her. "Diane!" Maria screamed into the CB. "Diane, respond." Nothing, not even static now. The CB had gone completely silent. Maria's GPS chimed. The female voice of the navigation system spoke. Maintain current speed. Remain in convoy formation. Do not deviate from the route. That wasn't normal GPS behavior. The systems didn't give warnings like that. Maria looked at the screen again and saw that her truck's position had moved up. She was now third in line, with only Cooper between her and Ray's truck. The route ahead showed approximately 90 miles remaining, but Maria's odometer still claimed she'd only traveled 64 miles since leaving Elko. Cooper's voice emerged from the CB, barely above a whisper. "Maria, are you still there?" "I'm here, Cooper, what's happening?" "I don't know, but I see lights up ahead, lots of lights. Maybe that's the facility, maybe we're almost there." Maria peered through her windshield but saw only darkness. "I don't see anything. How far ahead?" "Maybe a mile." "They're bright like stadium lights and there are structures, buildings, I think." "Ray must see them too, he's heading straight for them." "I'm going to wait. Wait, those aren't buildings." "Cooper, what are they?" His voice had dropped to a horrified whisper. "They're standing. They're all standing. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, all along both sides of the road. They're wearing clothes, different kinds of clothes, different time periods, and they're just standing there watching us." "Oh Jesus, their eyes are reflecting my headlights and they're all turning to look at me." Maria's GPS chimed again. "Warning, maintain current speed. Do not deviate from the route." "I'm slowing down," Cooper said. "I'm not driving into that, I'm not." His blue dot vanished from the GPS. Maria found herself sobbing, tears streaming down her face as she gripped the wheel. Only 2 blue dots remained on the screen now, Ray far ahead and her own truck. The GPS showed 45 miles to the destination. The road stretched empty in every direction, and Maria realized with creeping horror that she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen any landmark, any feature that distinguished 1 mile of highway from another. Ray's voice finally crackled back over the CB, but it didn't sound like him anymore. The words were his, but the tone was flat, mechanical, like a recording. "Maria, you're the last one. You're going to make it. Just follow the route. Follow the blue line. Don't look at the containers. Don't look in your mirrors. Just follow the line." "Ray, where are you? What happened to Cooper and Diane?" "They deviated. You can't deviate. The route is specific. The cargo must reach the facility. You must reach the facility." Maria wanted to slam on the brakes, to stop and run, but where would she go? The road stretched infinite in both directions, cutting through a landscape that no longer resembled Nevada or anywhere else on Earth. The sky above had taken on a strange purple tint, and distant lights pulsed on the horizon like dying stars. Her GPS showed 20 miles remaining. That's when she heard the scratching. It came from behind her, from the trailer, a sound like fingernails or claws dragging across metal. The sound Diane had described before she vanished. Maria's eyes flicked to her side mirrors, and she immediately wished she hadn't looked. Things moved across her trailer. Shapes that were almost human but wrong in fundamental ways, too many limbs, joints that bent in impossible directions, faces that were more like masks stretched over something else. They crawled and skittered across the white container, and as Maria watched in frozen horror, one of them turned its head toward her cab. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. "Don't look in your mirrors," Ray's voice repeated on the CB. "Just follow the route." Maria snapped her gaze back to the road ahead. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. The GPS showed 10 miles. She could see lights now, genuine lights, a cluster of them ahead where the road seemed to end. A facility of some kind, just as promised, with chain-link fencing and guard towers, and the other 3 trucks parked in neat rows. Ray's Kenworth, Cooper's Kenworth, Diane's Freightliner. All 3 were there, backed up to loading docks, empty of drivers. Men in dark suits moved around them with tablets and equipment, efficiently unloading the white containers. Maria's GPS chimed one final time. "You have reached your destination." She pulled her truck into the marked space, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate the controls. Before she could shut off the engine, her door opened. The thin man from the Elko warehouse stood there with his tablet, smiling politely. "Excellent timing, Ms. Hernandez. Right on schedule. Where are the others? Maria's voice cracked. Where are Ray and Cooper and Diane? The man's smile didn't waver. They've already been debriefed and released. You're the last one. If you'll come with me, we'll complete your paperwork and get you the rest of your payment. Maria climbed down from the cab on wobbly legs. She looked back at her trailer and saw that it was empty. The container was already gone, though she hadn't heard or felt anyone removing it. The scratching sounds had stopped. The thin man led her to a small office where he had her sign several documents. She tried to read them, but the words seemed to slide away from her eyes, refusing to form coherent meaning. He handed her an envelope thick with cash, far more than the agreed-upon amount. "You did very well," he said. "We'll be in touch if we need your services again." "I don't want to do this again," Maria whispered. "That's what they all say." The man's smile finally faded. "But you will. They always do. The money is too good, and eventually you start to forget the strange parts. Your mind smooths them over, makes them seem less impossible. Give it a week." Maria was escorted to a parking lot where her truck sat, trailer empty, ready to go. Her GPS showed a normal route back to Elko. The sun was rising on a normal desert morning. Everything seemed ordinary again. She drives regular routes now, standard cargo to standard destinations. But twice since that night, she's received calls from her dispatcher about special convoys with triple pay. Both times, she's turned them down, though it gets harder each time. The thin man was right. The memories are fading, becoming dreamlike and uncertain. Sometimes Maria wonders if she imagined the whole thing. But then she checks her bank account and sees the deposit from that night. Far more money than she could earn in a month. And she knows it was real. She knows that somewhere out there, convoys are still rolling along impossible roads, carrying cargo that shouldn't exist to facilities that can't be found on any map. And sometimes, late at night when she's driving through the Nevada desert, she swears she can see distant headlights in her mirror, keeping pace with her, waiting for her to accept the next call. Story 3. The Singing Road. Thomas Caldwell had been hauling timber from Oregon lumber mills for 23 years. At 51, he'd seen most of what the Pacific Northwest had to offer: magnificent forests, torrential rain, fog so thick you could barely see your hood, and coastal highways that twisted like snakes. But he'd never experienced anything like Highway 38 on the night of February 8, 2020. The load was routine: processed lumber heading from Reedsport to a distribution center in Eugene. Thomas had run this route dozens of times, usually during daylight hours, but a delayed loading schedule meant he was starting at 9:00 p.m. instead of his usual dawn departure. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust, and Thomas's Peterbilt 579 hummed contentedly as it climbed into the Coast Range. Highway 38 followed the Umpqua River through dense forest, a winding two-lane road that required constant attention. Thomas settled into the familiar rhythm of watching for deer, checking his mirrors, and adjusting his speed for the curves. Classic rock played low on his stereo, Tom Petty, as it happened, which would become darkly ironic before the night was over. At 10:17 p.m., the music stopped. Not the sudden cut of a lost signal or dead battery, but a gradual fade, as if someone had slowly turned down the volume. Thomas reached for the knob to turn it back up, but before his fingers touched it, he heard something else. A low humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the road beneath his wheels, from the air around his cab, from the trees pressing close on both sides. At first, Thomas thought something was wrong with his truck. He checked his gauges, but everything showed normal. Engine temperature good, oil pressure fine, all systems running smoothly. Yet the humming persisted, growing gradually louder, taking on a rhythmic quality that almost resembled music. The road was singing. That was the only way Thomas could think of it. The asphalt beneath his wheels produced a low, resonant tone that rose and fell in what might have been melody. He'd heard of musical roads, sections of highway with rumble strips cut at specific intervals to create recognizable tunes, but Highway 38 wasn't one of them. He'd driven this route countless times and never heard anything like this. Thomas slowed his truck from 50 to 40 miles per hour, then 30, listening intently. The slower he went, the more complex the sound became. It wasn't just a simple tone anymore, but multiple notes overlapping, harmonizing with each other in ways that seemed mathematically impossible. And beneath the musical tones, Thomas began to hear something else. Voices, hundreds of them, singing in languages he couldn't identify. He grabbed his CB radio. "This is Timber Tom on Highway 38, eastbound near mile marker 47. Anyone else hearing weird sounds out here tonight?" Static answered him. He tried different channels, but every frequency carried the same white noise. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this part of the mountains, but the timing felt ominous. The singing road grew louder. Thomas could feel it now, not just hear it. Vibrations coming up through his seat, through the steering wheel, resonating in his chest like standing next to enormous speakers. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and Thomas saw something that made his foot ease off the accelerator entirely. The white and yellow lines marking the highway were glowing, not reflecting his headlights but genuinely luminescent, pulsing in rhythm with the singing. As Thomas watched, the lines began to move, rippling like water, undulating in waves that spread outward from beneath his tires. He brought the Peterbilt to a full stop, air brakes hissing in the suddenly oppressive silence. No, not silence. The singing continued, but his engine had shut off. Thomas turned the key, pumped the accelerator, but nothing happened. The truck was dead, all its lights extinguished except for the eerie glow emanating from the road itself. Thomas sat in complete darkness inside his cab, the forest pressing close on both sides, and listened to the road sing. The voices had become clearer now, and with creeping horror he realized they were singing the same song, a slow, mournful melody that repeated over and over. He couldn't understand the words, but the emotion was unmistakable: grief, loss, and an overwhelming sense of something left unfinished. A light appeared ahead, moving through the trees along the roadside. Then another, and another. Soon dozens of lights floated between the trees, pale and ethereal, converging on the highway. They emerged onto the asphalt one by one, and as they did, Thomas could see that they weren't just lights but figures, translucent, ghostly shapes of people walking toward his truck. They were loggers. Thomas could see their clothing, their tools, flannel shirts and suspenders, heavy boots, axes, and saws of designs he'd only seen in museums. Some of them were injured, with terrible wounds visible in their transparent forms. They walked slowly, purposefully, their mouths open in song as they approached the Peterbilt from both directions. Thomas's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream, to flee, but his truck remained dead and his body seemed frozen in place. The ghost loggers reached his truck and began to walk through it, literally passing through the trailer, through the cab, through Thomas himself. The sensation was indescribable. As each spirit passed through him, Thomas experienced a flash of memory that wasn't his own. The bite of a saw blade, the crack of a tree beginning to fall, the moment of realization that you were standing in the wrong place, the crushing impact, the darkness. Death after death after death, each one a logging accident, each one a life cut short in these unforgiving mountains. Tears streamed down Thomas's face. He was experiencing their final moments, feeling their fear and pain and regret. How many were there? 50. 100. They kept coming, an endless procession of the dead, all singing that mournful song, all walking the highway that had been built through their burial ground. The road itself was a grave. That understanding hit Thomas with absolute certainty. Highway 38 had been cut through these mountains in the 1930s, carved through forest where logging camps had operated for decades. How many men had died here? How many had been buried in unmarked graves or simply left where they fell? The road had paved over their resting places, And now, on certain nights when conditions were right, they emerged to walk again, singing their grief into the darkness. Thomas didn't know how long he sat there, experiencing death after death, absorbing the memories of the lost loggers. It might have been 10 minutes or 3 hours. Time seemed irrelevant in the face of such accumulated sorrow. But eventually, the last ghost passed through his truck and disappeared into the forest on the other side of the road. The singing stopped. The glowing lines faded back to normal reflective paint, and Thomas's truck roared back to life, engine running as if it had never stopped, headlights cutting through the darkness. Thomas sat there for several more minutes, breathing heavily, wiping tears from his face. His hands shook as he reached for his CB radio. It crackled with normal traffic now, distant voices of other truckers on other roads. His cell phone showed 1 bar of signal. Everything had returned to normal except for Thomas himself, who felt fundamentally changed by what he'd witnessed. He put the truck in gear and continued driving. What else could he do? The lumber needed to reach Eugene, and his job was to deliver it. But for the rest of that journey, Thomas drove in complete silence. No radio, no music, just the sound of his truck and the whisper of wind through the trees. As he passed mile marker 63, Thomas saw a historical sign he'd never noticed before. He slowed down to read it. Site of Camp 7 disaster, 1932. 47 loggers killed in landslide. Memorial dedicated to the men who built the Pacific Northwest. 47. Thomas had counted them as they passed through his truck, though he'd wished he hadn't. 47 spirits walking the road that had been carved through their resting place. He reached Eugene at 3:42 a.m., 4 hours later than scheduled. The supervisor at the distribution center complained about the delay, but Thomas just nodded and signed the paperwork. What could he say? That he'd been stopped by the ghosts of dead loggers, that Highway 38 had sung him a song of grief and loss. Thomas requested reassignment the next day. He told his dispatcher he was tired of the timber runs, wanted something different, maybe hauling freight down I-5 instead. They granted his request without question. He never told anyone what happened on Highway 38 that night, partly because he knew no one would believe him, but mostly because it felt like a sacred thing, a secret that should be kept. He still drives through Oregon, still hauls loads across the state, but he avoids Highway 38. Sometimes, late at night when he's pulled over at a rest stop, he'll search online for information about logging accidents in the Coast Range. The articles are sparse. Most of the deaths happened before good records were kept, before safety regulations existed, when a logger was considered expendable, and accidents were just part of the cost of doing business. Thomas learned about the Camp 7 disaster of 1932. A section of mountain gave way during heavy rain, burying the entire logging camp under mud and rock. 47 men died in an instant, and because the camp was so remote and the bodies were buried so deep, they were never recovered. A priest came and blessed the site, and then the logging company moved operations elsewhere. When Highway 38 was planned in 1933, it was routed directly over the disaster site. The dead had been lying beneath the road for over 80 years, and Thomas had driven over them dozens of times, never knowing, never hearing. But on that clear February night, something had changed. Maybe it was the anniversary of their deaths. Maybe it was a particular alignment of moon and stars. Or maybe they simply chose Thomas to witness their sorrow, to acknowledge their existence, to remember that they were once living men with families and hopes and futures that had been crushed beneath a mountain. He does remember them. Every time he passes through timber country, sees logging trucks on the highway, or hears a chainsaw in the distance, Thomas thinks about the 47 men who walk Highway 38 at night, singing their eternal song. He thinks about the countless other workers who died building America's roads and bridges and tunnels, whose bones lie beneath the infrastructure we drive over every day without a second thought. And sometimes, very late at night, Thomas swears he can still hear that singing. Not from any road he's on, but from somewhere deep in his memory or perhaps from somewhere beyond. A chorus of voices that never stops, that will keep singing until someone finally listens and remembers and mourns. Story 4. The exit that wasn't there yesterday. Denise Kowalski had driven the stretch of I-90 between Boston and Albany so many times she could navigate it in her sleep. 29 years old with 6 years of over-the-road experience, she prided herself on knowing every rest stop, every quirk of the highway, every speed trap that local cops favored. So when she saw the exit sign on the night of November 12, 2018, she knew immediately that something was wrong. Exit 22A, that was the problem. There was no exit 22A on this stretch of I-90. Denise had her Volvo VNL set on cruise control at 68 miles per hour, hauling a load of consumer electronics from a distribution center in Worcester to a retail chain's warehouse in Albany. It was 11:43 p.m., and the highway was nearly empty. Just a few other trucks and the occasional car spread out across the dark Massachusetts countryside. She'd been listening to a podcast about unsolved mysteries, appropriately enough, when the green exit sign appeared in her headlights. Exit 22, a THORNWOD 1 mile. Denise frowned. She knew exit 21 and exit 22 well. They were about 12 miles apart, both leading to small towns that rolled up their sidewalks after dark. There was nothing between them except forest and the occasional farm. Certainly no town called Thornwood. She grabbed her phone and pulled up Google Maps. The app showed her position on I-90, but it displayed no exit 22A, no town named Thornwood. According to her GPS, she was still 7 miles from exit 22. That's weird, Denise muttered. She'd driven past plenty of old signs that hadn't been removed after exits were reconfigured, but this sign looked brand new, bright green with crisp white letters, no rust or wear, no bullet holes from drunk idiots with guns. A half-mile later, another sign appeared. Exit 22, a THORNWOD 1 2 mile. Denise's grip tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't just an old sign someone forgot to take down. Multiple signs meant there was actually an exit ahead, but how could that be? She'd driven this exact stretch of highway less than 48 hours ago on her way to Worcester, and there'd been no exit 22A. Her CB radio crackled to life. Hey, any eastbound traffic near exit 22? This is rolling thunder in the Black Kenworth. You got your ears on. Denise grabbed her mic. This is the white Volvo about 8 miles west of exit 22. What's up? You see anything weird tonight? Any construction or new signs? A chill ran down Denise's spine. Actually, yeah, I'm seeing signs for an exit 22A to someplace called Thornwood. You seeing those? A long pause followed. Then, no, I'm past that area already, but I was asking because about 30 minutes ago I saw signs for an exit 17B that I'd never seen before. Took me to some little town I'd never heard of. Stopped for coffee, got right back on the highway, but the whole thing felt off. Off how? Can't put my finger on it. The town looked normal but too quiet. No people even though there were lights on in the buildings. And the gas station attendant, Rolling Thunder's voice dropped. She never blinked. Not once in the 5 minutes I was there. Just stared at me with this smile that didn't reach her eyes. Denise felt goosebumps rising on her arms. I'm coming up on this exit 22A. Should I take it? Hell no, Rolling Thunder's voice rose urgently. That's why I'm calling out on the CB. I don't know what's going on, but something ain't right about these exits. Just keep driving, stay on the main highway. Copy that, thanks for the warning. Exit 22, a THORNWOD 1,000 feet, the exit ramp appeared ahead on the right, illuminated by standard highway lights. It looked completely normal. A proper off-ramp with a deceleration lane, merge lines, even a toll booth structure that matched others along the Massachusetts Turnpike. But Denise's GPS still showed nothing, just the regular highway continuing straight through this area. She kept her truck in the right lane as the exit approached, telling herself she was just going to drive past it, but something made her slow down slightly. Curiosity, maybe, or a truck driver's instinct to understand the road you're traveling. As she came level with the exit, Denise peered down the ramp. A town spread out below, its lights twinkling warmly in the darkness. It looked like dozens of other New England towns. A main street with shops, a church steeple, residential streets branching off in neat grids. Completely ordinary except for one detail that made Denise's blood run cold. Every light in every building was on. Every single one. Houses, shops, the church, street lights, traffic signals. Everything blazed with illumination, but Denise couldn't see a single person. No cars moving on the streets. No pedestrians on the sidewalks. Just empty brightness flooding an empty town. And then she saw the people standing at the end of the off-ramp. There were dozens of them, maybe more, forming a dense crowd on both sides of the ramp where it met the town's main street. They stood perfectly still, all facing the highway, their faces tilted up toward the passing traffic. Even from a distance, Denise could see that they were smiling, all of them, the same wide smile, welcoming and completely wrong. Denise pressed down on the accelerator. The Volvo's engine responded, pulling her away from exit 22A and back up to highway speed. In her mirror, she watched the exit recede into the darkness. The standing people remained motionless, still smiling, still waiting. Her CB crackled. "Did you pass it?" Rolling Thunder asked. "Yeah, Jesus, yeah, I passed it." There were people standing there, a whole crowd of them just waiting at the bottom of the ramp. "Same thing I saw at exit 17B, that's when I got the hell out of there." Denise wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cab's air conditioning. What the hell is going on? How can exits just appear? How can entire towns exist that aren't on any map? I don't know, and I don't want to know. I'm pulling into the travel center at exit 24 and waiting for daylight. You should do the same. It was solid advice, but Denise was still 2 hours from her delivery deadline. She needed to keep moving. "I've got to get to Albany. I'll just stay on the main highway, no exits, no stops. Be careful and keep your CB on. Call out if you see anything else weird." "Will do. Stay safe, Rolling Thunder." Denise drove for another 15 minutes without incident. The highway stretched ahead, familiar and normal. Her GPS showed her approaching exit 21. The real exit 21, the one that had always been there. She began to relax slightly, convincing herself that she'd passed whatever strangeness had manifested in exit 22A. Then she saw the next sign. Exit 22B ASHFILD crossing 2 miles. "No," Denise whispered. No, no, no. There was no exit 22B either. But the sign was there, bright and new and impossible. And if the pattern held, there would be another town below, another crowd of smiling people waiting at the bottom of the ramp. Denise grabbed her CB mic. "Rolling Thunder, you still listening? I'm here, what's wrong? There's another one, exit 22B now. They're multiplying. Get off the highway, take the next normal exit and find a place to wait this out." But Denise was afraid to take any exit now, even the familiar ones. What if they changed too? What if exit 21, which should lead to a town she'd visited a dozen times, now took her somewhere else? Somewhere with lights but no life, with smiling people who never blinked. "Exit 22 BASHFILD crossing 1 mile. I'm going to keep driving," Denise said. "I'm going to stay on the main highway until I reach Albany. I won't stop, won't take any exits." That's over 60 miles. I know, but I don't trust the exits anymore. Any of them. Exit 22, BASHFILD crossing 1 2-mile. Denise moved to the left lane, putting as much distance as possible between her truck and the upcoming exit. She set her cruise control at 75, pushing faster than the speed limit but needing to get past this thing quickly. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she forced herself to breathe deeply, to stay calm. As she approached exit 22B, she made the mistake of looking. This town was bigger than Thornwood, with more streets and taller buildings. And there were more people waiting at the bottom of the ramp, hundreds of them now, maybe 1,000, packed shoulder to shoulder. their faces tilted up in that terrible unified smile. But that wasn't the worst part. Some of them were waving. Slow, synchronized waves, all their arms moving in perfect unison, beckoning the passing traffic to take the exit, to come down and join them in their impossible town. Denise tore her eyes away and focused on the road ahead, her hands shaking on the wheel. The exits kept coming. 22C Millbrook Station, 22D Riverside Haven, 22E Cooper's Crossing. Each one featured a town that didn't exist, lit up like Christmas, populated by crowds of smiling, waving people who weren't quite right. Denise stopped looking. She kept her eyes locked on the highway ahead, tracking the white lines that divided the lanes, focusing on anything except the exits appearing every few miles. Her CB radio began picking up strange transmissions, voices that spoke too slowly, saying words that almost made sense but didn't quite connect into coherent meaning. "Come down, join us. We've been waiting. The town is ready. Everyone is here. Come down." Over and over, different voices, but the same message, layered on top of each other until it became a discordant chorus. Denise turned off the CB. The silence in her cab was oppressive, broken only by the rumble of her engine and the hum of tires on asphalt. She checked her GPS obsessively, watching the mile count tick down toward Albany. 50 miles, 45 miles, 40 miles. At 38 miles from Albany, the exit stopped appearing. Denise passed exit 22, the real exit 22, and it looked completely normal. No strange towns, no crowds of smiling people, just a standard off-ramp leading to a dark rural area. Her GPS showed it exactly where it should be. Everything had returned to normal. Or had it? Denise couldn't shake the feeling that she'd driven through something, passed from one version of the highway into another. She kept waiting for more impossible exits to appear, but the road remained stubbornly ordinary all the way to Albany. She delivered her load at 2:47 a.m., nearly an hour later than scheduled due to her high-speed flight through Massachusetts. The warehouse supervisor barely looked at her as she signed the paperwork, and Denise didn't mention why she was late. What could she say? She found a truck stop and parked, but she couldn't sleep. Instead, she searched online for any mention of exits appearing and disappearing on I-90, of towns that existed in the night but weren't on any maps. She found surprisingly little. A few scattered posts on paranormal forums, a couple of Reddit threads that had been deleted, one YouTube video from a trucker describing something similar on I-80 in Iowa. The comments on that video were disturbing. Several people claimed they'd taken the mysterious exits, driven down into those two bright towns with their smiling residents. Most said they'd immediately turned around and gotten back on the highway, but a few wrote that they'd stopped for gas or food. Those people described experiences that made Denise's skin crawl, conversations with townspeople who spoke in rehearsed phrases, buildings that looked normal from outside but were wrong inside, furniture arranged randomly, doors that opened to walls, windows that showed different views depending on which angle you looked, and an overwhelming sense that the town was performing being a town, mimicking what it thought human settlements should be. One commenter wrote, "I spent 20 minutes in one of these places before I realized I was the only person casting a shadow. Everyone else, everything else, no shadows, even in direct light. I ran back to my truck and got the hell out. When I looked back in my mirror, the whole town was dark. Every light had gone out at the exact same moment." Denise called Rolling Thunder on the CB. He was still parked at the travel center near exit 24, waiting for dawn. They talked for 2 hours, comparing notes, trying to make sense of what they'd seen. Neither of them had answers, just questions and a shared sense of having brushed against something deeply wrong with reality. "I'm putting in for vacation time," Rolling Thunder said as the sky began to light. "Gonna take a couple weeks off, stay home, forget about this." "Good idea," Denise agreed, though she knew she couldn't afford the time off. Bills didn't care about supernatural highways and impossible towns. She still drives I-90, but only during daylight now. She's rearranged her schedule, adjusted her routes, taken lower-paying loads, anything to avoid being on that stretch of highway after dark. Sometimes she wonders what would have happened if she'd taken one of those exits, driven down into Thornwood or Ashfield Crossing or any of the other towns that shouldn't exist. Would she have found her way back? Or would she be there still, standing at the bottom of an off-ramp, smiling up at the passing traffic, waving to drivers and beckoning them to come down, to join the crowd, to become part of whatever those towns really were? She'll never know, and that's fine with her. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some exits better left untaken. Denise just drives past them now, keeps her eyes forward, and counts down the miles until she reaches a destination that exists on maps and in the real world, solid, mundane, and blessedly normal. Story 5. The Passenger Who Leave. Carl Jensen didn't usually pick up hitchhikers. In 40 years of long-haul trucking, he'd broken that rule maybe 5 times, always during daylight, always in populated areas, and always with a gut feeling that the person was genuinely in need rather than looking for trouble. But on the night of August 3, 2017, somewhere along Highway 50 in Nevada, the loneliest road in America, Carl broke his rule one more time. The figure appeared in his headlights about 3 miles east of Austin, Nevada. A woman in a white dress standing on the shoulder of the highway, her thumb out in the classic hitchhiker's pose. Carl was hauling mining equipment to Ely, and the highway was deserted at 2:00 a.m., with nothing but sagebrush and darkness in every direction for dozens of miles. Carl's first instinct was to keep driving. Nothing good came from picking up strangers in the middle of nowhere. But as he approached, he could see the woman more clearly, mid-30s maybe, with long dark hair and an expression of such desperate hope that something in Carl's chest tightened. What if she was stranded? What if her car had broken down and she had no cell service? This stretch of Highway 50 was brutal. A person could die of exposure or dehydration out here if they were stuck without help. Against his better judgment, Carl began to slow down. The woman smiled as his truck approached, a wide, grateful smile that seemed genuine. She wasn't dressed appropriately for the desert night, just that white dress, no jacket, no visible bag or supplies. That should have warned Carl off, but instead it strengthened his resolve to help. She was clearly in trouble. He brought the Peterbilt to a stop about 20 feet past her, air brakes hissing. In his mirror, he watched her walk toward the truck with quick, eager steps. Carl rolled down his passenger window as she reached the door. "Need a lift?" he called down. "Oh God, yes, thank you so much." Her voice was bright, almost musical. "I've been stuck out here for hours. My phone's dead and I haven't seen a single car until you came along." "Where's your vehicle?" Carl asked, scanning the roadside for a disabled car. "About 5 miles back. It just died on me, wouldn't restart. I started walking, hoping to flag someone down." She looked up at him with enormous brown eyes that reflected his cab lights. "Can you take me to the next town? I can call someone from there." Every instinct Carl had developed over 4 decades screamed at him to apologize and drive away. But how could he leave her out here in the middle of the night? The next town was 30 miles away, and who knew when another vehicle would come along? "All right," Carl heard himself say. "Climb on in. I'm heading to Ely, but I can drop you in Eureka." "Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver." She pulled open the door and hoisted herself into the cab with surprising ease, settling into the passenger seat and fastening her seatbelt. "I'm Sarah. Carl, nice to meet you, though I wish it was under better circumstances." She laughed, a pleasant sound that somehow set Carl's teeth on edge despite its normalcy. Better than being stranded in the desert. Carl put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. For the first few minutes, they rode in silence. Sarah sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead at the road illuminated by the headlights. Carl tried to think of something to say, but the quiet felt heavy, oppressive, and he found himself reluctant to break it. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Do you pick up hitchhikers often?" "No, hardly ever. You're lucky I was feeling charitable tonight." "Lucky," Sarah repeated, her voice oddly flat. "Yes, I suppose I am." Carl glanced at her. In the dim light from his dashboard, her face looked pale, almost luminescent. Those big eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, unblinking. Carl realized with a start that he hadn't seen her blink since she got in the truck. "So, what happened to your car?" he asked, trying to distract himself from that unsettling observation. "It stopped working." Sarah's voice maintained that same flat quality. One moment it was running fine, and the next, everything just stopped. "Did the engine make any sounds? Knocking, grinding?" "No sounds, just silence, complete silence." Carl nodded, though that didn't make much sense. Cars didn't usually die without some warning, overheating, weird noises, warning lights. But he wasn't a mechanic, and maybe modern vehicles could just shut down without preamble. They drove for another 10 minutes. Carl became increasingly aware of Sarah's stillness. She didn't shift position, didn't adjust her seatbelt, didn't fidget or look around like a normal passenger would. She just sat there, hands in lap, eyes forward, that faint smile on her lips. "You got family in Eureka?" Carl asked, desperate to make her seem more human, more normal. "No family. Friends." "No friends. Then who are you calling when we get there?" Sarah turned to look at him for the first time since entering the truck. Her neck rotated with an odd, mechanical precision, and when her eyes met his, Carl felt ice water flood his veins. Those weren't normal eyes. They were too dark, too deep, like looking into wells that went down forever. "I'm not calling anyone, Carl." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Then why did you say?" "I said what you needed to hear to let me in." Sarah's smile widened, showing too many teeth. People are so predictable. Show them someone in need and their compassion overrides their caution. Every time. Carl's heart hammered. He glanced at the passenger door, judging whether he could lean across and open it, push her out, but they were doing 70 miles per hour. Even if she was something wrong, he couldn't throw her from a moving vehicle. "What do you want?" His voice came out steadier than he felt. "To ride, to experience, to understand." Sarah's head tilted at an angle that was just slightly too far, like a bird examining something curious. "You have such interesting lives, you humans. Always moving, always seeking, never satisfied with staying in one place. I wanted to feel that." "I'm going to pull over," Carl said slowly. "And you're going to get out of my truck." "I don't think so." Sarah's voice took on a quality that bypassed Carl's ears and seemed to resonate directly in his skull. "We have 30 more miles to Eureka. I'd like to experience all 30 of them." Carl reached for his CB radio, but his hand passed right through it. He blinked, looked again, and saw that the radio was still there, solid and real, but somehow his hand couldn't interact with it. He tried again, reaching for the dashboard, the steering wheel, the door handle, but his hand slid through everything as if he'd become a ghost. "What did you do to me?" Panic rose in his chest. "What the hell are you?" "I didn't do anything to you. You're fine." "But you can't make calls or stop the truck. Not until I'm done experiencing." Sarah reached out and placed her hand on Carl's shoulder. He felt nothing. No pressure, no warmth, no physical contact at all, though he could see her pale hand resting there. The truck continued down the highway, maintaining its speed, though Carl was no longer certain he was the one driving it. His hands moved the wheel when necessary, his foot adjusted the accelerator, but it felt like someone else was controlling his body, using him as a puppet. "Please," Carl whispered. "I have grandchildren, I have a wife waiting for me in Sacramento. Please don't hurt me." "Hurt you?" Sarah sounded genuinely puzzled. "Why would I hurt you? You're helping me. You picked me up when I needed a ride. That's kindness, Carl. I appreciate kindness." They drove through the night, past mile markers that Carl couldn't quite read, past landscapes that seemed to repeat themselves in endless loops. The highway stretched forever ahead, and Carl began to wonder if they'd ever reach Eureka, or if they were trapped in some eternal journey with this thing wearing Sarah's face sitting beside him. Sarah talked as they drove. She asked questions about Carl's life, where he'd been, what he'd seen, how it felt to cross the country in a truck, whether he ever got lonely, whether he ever wondered what else was out there beyond the highways and towns. Carl answered mechanically, his voice coming from far away, and some detached part of his mind noted that Sarah never actually listened to his responses. She just asked more questions, collecting his words like a child collecting stones, without regard for their meaning or value. Time became meaningless. Carl's dashboard clock showed 2:47 a.m., but it had shown 2:47 a.m. for what felt like hours. The road remained dark, the sky remained black, and Sarah remained perfectly still beside him except for her lips moving with those endless questions. Then, abruptly, Sarah announced, "We're here." Carl blinked and realized they were pulling into Eureka. The small town materialized around them as if it had been hiding just beyond the edge of visibility. Street lights glowed yellow. A few buildings showed lit windows. Everything looked blessedly normal. The truck moving under its own volition or Carl's returned control, he wasn't sure which, pulled into an empty parking lot beside a closed gas station. The engine shut off. The sudden silence was deafening. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The dome light didn't turn on, and in the darkness, Carl couldn't see her face anymore, just a pale shape moving in the shadows. "Thank you for the ride, Carl. I understand better now." Her voice came from very close to his ear, though she was already out of the truck. "I understand why you keep moving, why you never stop. You're all running from something, aren't you? From stillness, from silence, from the empty spaces between destinations." "What are you?" Carl managed to ask. "I'm what lives in those empty spaces. I'm what waits in the dark between the towns. I'm what rides the highways when there's no one else around." A pause. "I'm the loneliness that names this road." The passenger door slammed shut. Carl sat frozen for several seconds before he could move again. When he looked out the passenger window, Sarah was gone. The parking lot was empty. No figure in a white dress, no evidence anyone had been there at all. Carl's hands shook as he tried to restart his truck. The engine turned over normally, all his controls responded to his touch, and the dashboard clock jumped forward to 4:23 a.m. Nearly 2.5 hours had passed, though it had felt like much longer. He checked his logbook out of habit and found that something had made entries for him. Perfect handwriting documented his journey. Departed Austin at 2:03 a.m., arrived Eureka at 4:23 a.m. Nothing unusual, nothing to indicate the horror of what had actually happened during those hours. Carl drove the rest of the way to Ely in a state of shock. He delivered his load, collected his paperwork, and immediately headed back west, retracing his route. He had to see if Sarah's car was really there, 5 miles east of Austin like she'd claimed. He reached that stretch of Highway 50 at 9:00 a.m. with the sun bright and hot overhead. He drove slowly, scanning both sides of the road for any sign of a disabled vehicle. He covered 10 miles in each direction, going far beyond where Sarah said her car had died. There was nothing. No car, no tire tracks leaving the highway, no evidence anyone had been stranded there. Just empty desert stretching to the horizon with the highway cutting through it like a scar. Carl pulled over at the exact spot where he'd picked up Sarah. In the daylight, he could see there was nothing there. No footprints in the dust beside the road. No disturbed gravel where someone might have been standing for hours. It was as if she'd materialized from nothing, had never been real at all. But she had been real. Carl could still feel the weight of her presence in his passenger seat, could still hear her voice asking those endless questions, could still remember the horrible wrongness of her eyes when she'd looked at him. He got back in his truck and drove away quickly, fighting the urge to speed. For the next week, Carl couldn't bring himself to drive at night. He rearranged his schedule, took loads that let him travel during daylight hours, and pulled over at truck stops as soon as the sun began to set. His dispatcher noticed the change and asked if something was wrong. Carl claimed he was having night vision problems and was seeing a doctor about it. The symptoms gradually faded. After a month, Carl could drive at night again without his hands shaking. After 3 months, he'd almost convinced himself that he'd experienced some kind of fatigue-induced hallucination, that Sarah hadn't been real, that nothing supernatural had happened. But he never picked up another hitchhiker. Not once in the years between that night and his retirement. And whenever he drove Highway 50 through Nevada, especially at night, he kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead and his passenger door locked. Because sometimes, in the corner of his vision, he'd catch a glimpse of a figure in white standing beside the highway, thumb out, waiting patiently for the next driver whose compassion would override their caution. The loneliest road in America. Now Carl understood why it had earned that name, and he knew it had nothing to do with the distance between towns. Story 6. The Weighing Station. Robert Mendez pulled his Mac Anthem onto the scale at the Highway 183 weighing station in South Dakota at exactly 4:17 a.m. on June 21, 2019. It was the summer solstice, though Robert didn't know that at the time and wouldn't have cared if he did. He was hauling frozen meat from a processing plant in Sioux Falls to a distribution center in Rapid City, and the only thing on his mind was getting through the weigh station quickly so he could make up time and hit his delivery window. The facility looked standard from the outside. A low building with large windows, several scale lanes, and the usual collection of signs warning drivers about weight limits and inspection procedures. One lane was marked open with flashing green lights, while the others showed red. Robert guided his truck onto the designated scale and waited for the weight reading to appear on the overhead display. The screen remained blank. After 30 seconds, Robert checked his mirrors to see if anyone was coming out of the building to wave him through or pull him aside for inspection. The building's windows glowed with fluorescent light, but he couldn't see any people moving inside. No one manned the scale house and no DOT officers appeared to check his logbook. "Come on," Robert muttered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He'd been driving for 9 hours and still had another 5 to go. He didn't have time for delays. A speaker crackled to life somewhere near his truck, though Robert couldn't see where it was mounted. A woman's voice emerged, pleasant and professional. "Please remain on the scale. Your vehicle is being evaluated." Evaluated. Robert grabbed his CB mic, though he wasn't sure why. The voice had come from an external speaker, not his radio. "How long is this going to take?" No response. The speaker remained silent. Robert waited another minute, then 2, his irritation growing. Through his windshield, he could see the empty highway stretching ahead. This was ridiculous. The scale should give an instant reading. That was the whole point of modern weigh stations. Something was wrong with their equipment, and now he was stuck here waiting for someone to fix it. He was about to shut off his engine and walk into the building to complain when the overhead display finally lit up. But instead of showing his truck's weight, it displayed a single word in bright red letters. Insufficient. Robert stared at the display, confused. Insufficient. What did that mean? His load was well under the legal weight limit. He'd made sure of that before leaving Sioux Falls. And even if he was overweight, the display would show the actual weight and indicate by how many pounds he exceeded the limit. The speaker crackled again. "Your load is insufficient. Please proceed to the inspection area on your right." "Insufficient how?" Robert called out, though he knew the speaker probably didn't have a microphone feeding back to whoever was controlling it. "I've got the manifest right here. Everything S in order." The display changed. "Proceed to inspection area." Right, a set of lights activated along the right side of the facility, illuminating a side lot that Robert hadn't noticed before. It was partially hidden behind the main building, accessed through a gate that was now slowly opening. Robert had been through dozens of weigh stations across the country, and he'd never seen a setup quite like this. He considered just pulling off the scale and continuing down the highway. What could they do? Chase him? But DOT violations were serious business, and fleeing a way station could cost him his CDL. With a frustrated sigh, Robert put the truck in gear and followed the lights into the inspection area. The side lot was larger than it appeared from the highway, extending back into darkness that the overhead lights didn't quite penetrate. Robert saw other trucks parked in neat rows, maybe a dozen of them, all with their lights off, apparently empty of drivers. That was odd. Where were the other truckers? Inside the building being processed, a figure emerged from the shadows between the parked trucks. A man in what looked like a DOT officer's uniform, dark pants, light shirt, badge visible on his chest. He waved Robert toward an empty parking space in the front row. Robert complied, parking his truck and shutting off the engine. The officer approached his driver's side door. Robert rolled down the window, ready with his license, registration, and logbook. But the officer didn't ask for any of those things. Instead, he looked up at Robert with an expression that seemed simultaneously concerned and curious. "Mr. Mendez, do you know why we've directed you to the inspection area? Your sign said my load is insufficient, but I don't know what that means. I've got 16,000 pounds of frozen meat, well under the 40,000-pound limit for this type of trailer." The officer shook his head slowly. "It's not the physical weight that's insufficient, Mr. Mendez. It's the other weight." The other weight. Robert felt frustration turning to confusion and the first hints of unease. What are you talking about? The weight of experience, the weight of memory, the weight of the journey itself. The officer's eyes, Robert noticed they were an unusual pale gray color, held his gaze. "Your cargo has been traveling for only 9 hours. It hasn't accumulated sufficient weight for passage." Robert's mouth went dry. Passage? Passage where? Through the gate, beyond the station, into the next leg of your journey. The officer gestured toward the darkness at the back of the lot. "All freight that crosses this way station must carry adequate weight of both body and spirit. Your meat has body weight, yes, but it lacks the weight that comes from truly traveling. It needs more time on the road, more miles under its wheels, more experience of the journey." "This doesn't make any sense," Robert said, but even as he spoke, he felt reality shifting around him, becoming fluid and strange. The lights overhead seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The other trucks in the lot appeared to shimmer at the edges, as if they weren't quite solid. The officer reached up and placed his hand on Robert's door. His touch felt cold, even through the metal. "You have a choice, Mr. Mendez. You can continue to your destination with your current cargo, but you'll never reach it. The road will stretch forever, adding miles that your odometer won't record, taking you through places that don't exist on your maps. Or you can wait here until your cargo gains sufficient weight, and then you'll be allowed passage." "How long would I have to wait?" The officer smiled, and there was genuine sympathy in his expression. "For most drivers, a few hours; for some, days. Time moves differently here in the weighing station between places, but you'll be safe while you wait, and your cargo will absorb the weight it needs." Robert looked past the officer at the rows of parked trucks. "Are there drivers in those trucks?" "Some. The ones who chose to wait. Others are inside the facility in our rest area, having coffee and thinking about their journeys. We take care of everyone who stops here. That's our purpose, to ensure that all things traveling through carry the proper weight. And if I refuse, if I just drive away," the officer's smile faded, "then you'll become one of the travelers who never arrives. Your family will wait for you in Rapid City, but you won't come. Your dispatcher will try to call, but you won't answer. Search parties will look for your truck, but they'll never find it. You'll be driving forever, watching your destination approach in your GPS but never reaching it because your cargo doesn't have the weight needed to complete the passage." Robert felt tears prickling his eyes. "This can't be real. This is insane. Reality is more complex than most people understand. There are rules, Mr. Mendez. Ancient rules that govern how things move through space, through time, through the boundaries between one place and another. This way station exists to enforce those rules. We measure what needs to be measured. Robert sat in silence, trying to process what he was hearing. Part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that he should start his truck and drive away as fast as possible. But a deeper part, a part that had always sensed there was something more to the endless highways he traveled, whispered that the officer was telling the truth. "If I wait," Robert asked slowly, "how will I know when my cargo has enough weight?" "You'll feel it. The truck will feel different," settled Reddy, "and the display at the scale will change from insufficient to cleared." The officer stepped back from the truck. "Take your time deciding. We're patient here. We have all the time in the world." He walked away, disappearing between the parked trucks. Robert sat alone in his cab, watching the facility's lights pulse and shimmer. He thought about his wife waiting at home, about his daughter's birthday next week, about all the normal things that made up his life beyond these strange highways. He thought about just driving away, but when he looked at his ignition, he found that his keys were gone. He couldn't remember removing them, but his hand was empty and the ignition was bare. When he checked his pockets, he found only lint and a receipt from his last fuel stop. With no other choice, Robert climbed down from his truck. The pavement under his feet felt slightly soft, as if it wasn't quite solid. He walked toward the main building, passing the other parked trucks. As he passed each one, he glanced in the windows and saw drivers sitting motionless in their cabs, staring straight ahead, waiting. The building's interior was well lit and clean, with rows of plastic chairs and several vending machines along one wall. A coffee station offered free beverages in styrofoam cups. 3 other drivers sat scattered around the room, 2 men and a woman, all with the 1,000-yard stare of people who'd been waiting far too long. Robert poured himself coffee and sat down. An old television mounted in the corner showed what looked like security camera footage of the highway outside, trucks passing by normally, completely unaware of this strange pocket of reality tucked beside the road. "How long have you been here?" Robert asked the nearest driver, a heavy-set man with a beard. The man looked at him with dull eyes. "I'm not sure anymore. Started counting days, but then I lost track. My cargo was antiques, old furniture, vintage clothing. The officer said it already had too much weight, too many memories attached to it, said I had to wait for it to forget some of its history before it could move forward." "That doesn't make any sense," Robert said. The bearded man laughed bitterly. "None of this makes sense, friend, but here we are anyway." Robert spent the next several hours. At least he thought it was hours. The clock on the wall never seemed to move, talking with the other waiting drivers. Each had their own strange story. The woman had been hauling newly manufactured electronics and was told her cargo lacked any weight at all, that it needed to exist for longer before it could travel. Another man had been transporting medical supplies and was informed that his cargo carried too much urgency, too much weight of human need, and had to shed some of that emotional burden before passage would be permitted. Eventually, Robert went back outside to check on his truck. The other vehicles in the lot hadn't moved. Their drivers still sat frozen in their cabs, or perhaps they'd gone inside while Robert was in the building. It was impossible to tell. Robert walked to the back of his refrigerated trailer and placed his hand against the metal. He couldn't feel anything unusual, but the officer's words echoed in his mind. The weight of experience, the weight of memory, the weight of the journey itself. What did that even mean? How could inanimate cargo accumulate those things? But as Robert stood there, his hand pressed against the cold trailer, he began to understand, or at least to accept that there was something to understand beyond his normal comprehension of how the world worked. He went back inside and waited, coffee after coffee, hour after hour, while the clock refused to advance and the other drivers sat in their resigned stupor. Robert tried his cell phone periodically, but it showed no signal. He tried the door that supposedly led to the scale house and offices, but it was locked and no one answered his knocking. Then suddenly he felt it. A shift in the air, a change in the quality of the light, a sense of something completing itself. Robert stood up from his chair, nearly knocking over his coffee, and rushed outside. His truck looked the same but felt different, settled, solid, real in a way it hadn't been before. Robert climbed into the cab and found his keys sitting in the ignition, waiting for him. The clock on his dashboard showed 6:42 a.m., only 2.5 hours after he'd entered the way station, though it had felt like much longer. He started the engine, which turned over perfectly, and drove slowly back to the main scale area. The overhead display lit up as his truck rolled onto the platform. Cleared 4-passage safe travels the gate on the far side of the scale opened, revealing the highway beyond. Morning light was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Robert drove through the gate and back onto Highway 183, his refrigerated trailer humming behind him. He reached Rapid City without incident and delivered his load on schedule. The meat was perfectly frozen, showing no signs of the extra time it had supposedly spent gaining weight at the station. His logbook showed normal progression of hours, with no unexplained gaps. Everything appeared routine, but Robert couldn't forget the experience. He researched the way station afterward, looking for information about its location and operation. According to the South Dakota website, there was no permanent way station on Highway 183. The nearest one was 50 miles away on a different route. He talked to other truckers, carefully bringing up the subject of strange way stations without sounding crazy. Most looked at him blankly, but a few older drivers, veterans of decades on the road, nodded slowly and changed the subject, and Robert knew they'd been there too. To the weighing station that measured more than physical mass. To the place between places where cargo gathered the weight of its journey. Robert still drives, still hauls freight across the country, but now he pays attention to things he'd previously ignored. He notices when his cargo feels heavy beyond its mere pounds, when the weight of time and experience settles into his trailer. He's learned to recognize the signs that a load has accumulated the proper weight for passage, a certain solidity, a gravity that goes beyond physics. And late at night, when he's driving through empty country with only his headlights cutting through the darkness, Robert sometimes sees other way stations that don't appear on any maps, their lights glowing softly beside highways that seem to exist in multiple realities at once. He keeps driving past them now, having learned that once your cargo has the weight it needs, you don't stop at those stations again. But he wonders about the drivers who are still there, waiting in that fluorescent lit room for their cargo to gain or shed whatever weight is required. He wonders if they'll ever be released, or if they're trapped forever in that moment between departure and arrival, measuring something that can't be quantified on any scale designed by human engineers. Story 7. The Backwards Mile. Jennifer Wong had been driving refrigerated goods up and down the West Coast for 8 years when she encountered the Backwards Mile. It happened on Interstate 5 in California, that long, monotonous stretch between Los Angeles and San Francisco that trucks traveled day and night, carrying the commerce that kept the state running. The date was September 15, 2021, and Jennifer was hauling pharmaceuticals from a warehouse in Irvine to a medical supply company in Sacramento. The time was 3:27 a.m. when Jennifer passed mile marker 278, heading north at her usual 68 miles per hour. The highway was nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional truck or car and vast stretches of darkness broken only by headlights. Jennifer had her thermos of coffee in the cup holder, a playlist of classic rock running through her speakers, and 6 more hours of driving ahead of her. She watched mile marker 279 approach and pass on her right, counting down the miles as she always did, tracking her progress north. Then came marker 280. She glanced at her GPS to confirm her position. Yes, she was exactly where she should be, making good time, no problems. 30 seconds later, mile marker 280 appeared again. Jennifer's eyes snapped to the green sign as it passed. The reflective numbers clearly showed 280, identical to the marker she just passed. She must have misread it the first time, she told herself. Maybe it had been 281 and her tired eyes had played tricks on her. But then came mile marker 279. Jennifer's hands tightened on the wheel. That was wrong. Markers should be counting upward as she traveled north, not downward. She checked her GPS again. It showed her moving forward normally, approaching mile marker 281. But the physical marker she just passed definitely said 279. "What the hell?" Jennifer muttered, scanning the roadside for some explanation. Construction zones sometimes had temporary markers that got confusing, but she'd seen no warning signs, no orange cones, no indication of any work being done. Mile marker 278 passed on her right. Now genuine fear crept into Jennifer's chest. She was traveling north at highway speed, but the mile markers were counting backwards. And not just out of sequence. They were the exact same markers she'd passed minutes earlier, in reverse order. She recognized a particular dent in marker 278's post, remembered noticing it the first time she'd passed it. Jennifer grabbed her CB radio. "This is the white Volvo hauling north on I-5, around mile marker 278. Anyone else on this stretch? I need someone to confirm something for me." Static answered her for several seconds, then a man's voice crackled through. "This is southbound on I-5, just past the Harris Ranch exit. What do you need confirmed, Volvo? The mile markers, are they showing the right numbers, going in the right direction?" A pause. "Yeah, they're counting down as I go south like they should. Why? You seeing something weird?" "I'm heading north, but my markers are counting down too. I'm going backwards somehow, even though I'm moving forward." The southbound driver's voice grew concerned. That doesn't make sense. You sure you're heading north? Maybe you got turned around." Jennifer looked at her GPS, at the stars visible through her windshield, at the highway stretching ahead in her headlights. "No, I'm definitely heading north. The GPS confirms it, but the mile markers are wrong. Maybe pull over and take a break. You might be more tired than you think." Jennifer wanted to argue, but mile marker 277 passed on her right, and she realized she had no rational explanation for what was happening. "Yeah, maybe you're right, thanks." But she didn't pull over. Something told her that stopping would be worse than continuing. She needed to keep moving, needed to push through this backwards mile, or miles, she was now realizing with growing dread, and get back to normal highway on the other side. Mile marker 276 passed. Then 275. Then 274. Jennifer watched her odometer ticking upward, counting the distance she was traveling. According to her truck's instruments, she was covering ground normally. Her GPS showed smooth northward progress, but the physical mile markers told a different story, counting backwards as if she was traveling south even though everything else indicated forward motion. "This is impossible," Jennifer whispered. "This violates physics. You can't go forward and backward at the same time." But apparently she could. The highway remained straight, with no turns or curves that might have confused her sense of direction. The stars overhead held their positions, confirming her northward heading. Other vehicles passed occasionally, southbound trucks and cars in the opposite lanes that seemed to be experiencing no problems. But whenever Jennifer passed another northbound vehicle and tried to flag them down or signal, they didn't respond, didn't seem to see her desperate attempts at communication. Mile marker 270 passed. Jennifer realized she'd been traveling backwards, or forward into backward space, or whatever this was, for 8 miles now. Her GPS showed her near marker 288, a discrepancy of 18 miles between the physical markers and her electronic navigation. That's when the landscape began to change. At first, Jennifer thought it was just her tired mind playing tricks, but as she continued driving, the changes became undeniable. The The flat agricultural land that dominated this part of I-5 began to slope and roll, forming hills that didn't exist according to her GPS. Trees appeared along the roadside, tall pines that shouldn't grow in this climate. The highway itself remained the same asphalt, the same lane markings, the same general appearance, but the world around it was transforming into something else. Mile marker 265 passed. The highway began to curve gently, winding through the increasingly forested landscape. Jennifer's GPS showed her continuing on the arrow-straight section of I-5, but her actual view through the windshield displayed a road with personality, with character, with features that made no sense for this location. She passed a rest area that shouldn't exist, not on her GPS, not in her memory of this route. But there it was, complete with parking spaces and restrooms and picnic tables, illuminated by bright lights that made the scene look almost inviting. A few cars were parked there, and Jennifer could see people standing near the restroom building, talking and gesturing normally. Should she stop, ask for help, confirm that she wasn't hallucinating all of this? No. The same instinct that told her not to pull over earlier now screamed at her to keep moving. Those people in the rest area felt wrong somehow, too normal, too casual for this impossible landscape she was traveling through. They were props, stage dressing, meant to lure her into stopping. Jennifer pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing her speed up to 75. The backwards mile markers continued their countdown: 260, 259, 258. The landscape grew even stranger. Massive rock formations jutting up beside the highway, a river running parallel to the road where no river existed in reality, distant mountains that looked like they belonged in a fantasy painting rather than California's Central Valley. And then she saw the other trucks. They appeared in her headlights one by one, parked along the shoulder of this impossible highway. Trucks of all kinds, semis, box trucks, tankers, sitting dark and empty, their hazard lights flashing in perfect synchronization. Jennifer counted them as she passed: 7, 8, 9, a dozen, 2 dozen. Some looked new, but others were vintage models from decades past, their paint faded and bodies rusted. Mile marker 250 passed. Jennifer had been traveling backwards for 30 miles now, covering that distance in about 25 minutes. If the pattern continued, would she reach marker 0? And what happened then? Would she emerge somewhere else, or would she simply cease to exist, having traveled backwards out of reality itself? The parked trucks grew denser, lining both sides of the highway now, creating a corridor of silent vehicles. Jennifer's headlights illuminated their darkened cabs, and in several of them she could see shapes, drivers sitting motionless behind their steering wheels, staring straight ahead, waiting for something that might never come. Jennifer's breath came in short gasps. Panic clawed at her chest, threatening to overwhelm her ability to think clearly. She wanted to scream, to slam on the brakes, to wake up from this nightmare. But some part of her remained calm, continued driving, continued moving forward through the backwards miles. Mile marker 245. The highway began to descend, sloping downward into what looked like a valley, though no such valley existed in this part of California. Fog began to appear, wisps at first, then thick banks that her headlights could barely penetrate. The parked trucks became ghostly silhouettes in the mist. Then Jennifer saw the sign ahead, barely visible through the fog. End of backwards mile, normal travel resumes in 1,000 feet. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy. An end. There was an end to this. She just had to drive another 1,000 feet and she'd be back on normal highway, back in the real world. The fog grew so thick that Jennifer could barely see beyond her hood. She slowed to 40 miles per hour, afraid of rear-ending one of the parked trucks or driving off the road entirely. The backwards mile markers had stopped appearing, or maybe they were there but invisible in the fog. Everything was white, formless, undefined. And then she was through. The fog disappeared as suddenly as if she'd driven through a curtain. Jennifer found herself on normal I-5, heading north, the landscape flat and agricultural again. Her GPS showed her near mile marker 310. She'd somehow jumped from marker 278 to marker 310, covering 32 miles in the time it took to drive through the backward stretch. Or she traveled those 32 miles twice, once forward and once backward, somehow occupying both directions simultaneously until she emerged past her starting point. Jennifer's head throbbed trying to make sense of it. She pulled into the next rest area, a real one that appeared on her GPS, and parked. Her hands shook so badly she could barely turn off the engine. She sat in her cab for 20 minutes, breathing deeply, drinking water, trying to ground herself in reality. When she finally felt calm enough to continue, Jennifer logged the experience in her private journal. She'd been keeping one since her first year of trucking, recording the strange things that sometimes happened on the road, things that didn't fit into neat, rational explanations. The backwards mile was the strangest entry yet. She delivered her pharmaceuticals to Sacramento on schedule, with no one commenting on any delays or anomalies in her trip. According to all official records, her drive had been completely normal, but Jennifer couldn't forget those parked trucks she'd seen lining the impossible highway, their drivers sitting motionless in their cabs. Had they entered the backwards mile and never found their way out? Were they trapped forever, traveling in reverse while the real world moved forward without them? She researched online, carefully phrasing her searches to avoid sounding insane. She found scattered references to similar phenomena, drivers reporting stretches of highway where mile markers ran backwards, where the landscape transformed into something impossible, where the rules of normal travel no longer applied. Most of these accounts were dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucinations or hoaxes. But a few were accompanied by unexplained details that resonated with Jennifer's experience. Trucks that vanished from GPS tracking for 20 or 30 minutes before reappearing miles ahead of their last known position. Drivers who arrived at destinations with large gaps in their memory of the journey. Reports of vintage trucks parked along highways that disappeared when authorities went to investigate. Jennifer developed a theory, though she had no way to prove it. There were places where the highway existed in multiple states simultaneously, where forward and backward travel occupied the same space, where drivers could slip between realities without realizing it. The backwards mile was one of these places, a fold in the fabric of the road itself. She continued trucking, but she paid closer attention to mile markers now, watching for any indication that they might start counting in the wrong direction. She memorized the exact location where she'd entered the backwards mile, between markers 278 and 279 on northbound I-5, and she felt her heart rate spike every time she approached that section. Most times, nothing happened. The highway remained normal, the markers counted upward properly, and Jennifer passed through without incident. But twice more in the following year, she entered the backwards mile. Each time, she emerged miles ahead of where she should be, having traveled forward by going backward, experiencing something that should be impossible but undeniably was. The second time, she tried to document it, taking video on her phone and narrating what she was seeing. But when she reviewed the footage afterward, it showed only normal highway, no backwards markers, no transformed landscape, no parked trucks. The camera recorded what should be there, not what Jennifer actually saw. The third time, she encountered another driver in the backwards mile. A man in a Peterbilt who was also traveling north, also experiencing the reversed markers and impossible landscape. They communicated via CB radio as they traveled together through the strangeness, confirming details with each other, proving that they weren't hallucinating independently. When they emerged back into normal space, the other driver pulled over immediately and stopped. Jennifer saw him in her mirrors, sitting motionless in his cab, probably struggling with the same existential questions she dealt with after her first experience. She considered stopping to talk with him, to share their experience, but decided against it. What could they say to each other? What comfort could they offer? Jennifer drives I-5 regularly, still hauling refrigerated goods up and down the coast. She knows that somewhere between Los Angeles and San Francisco, there's a mile that runs backwards, a fold in reality where the highway contradicts itself. She knows that other drivers have experienced it, though most will never speak of it, afraid of being labeled crazy or losing their CDL to a mandatory psychological evaluation. And she knows that each time she drives through it, she's traveling through a place where the normal rules don't apply, where distance and direction become relative rather than absolute. It doesn't frighten her anymore, this backwards mile. It's just another aspect of the road, another strange truth that long-haul truckers eventually learn. The highways we travel are stranger than any map can show, and the miles we cover sometimes lead us places that shouldn't exist. Story 8. The fuel that never runs out. Marcus Johnson should have run out of diesel somewhere near the Colorado-Kansas border. He knew his fuel economy down to the decimal point, 6.3 miles per gallon when fully loaded, running at 65 miles per hour on flat terrain. He'd filled up at a Love S in Denver at 6:00 p.m. on October 31, 2018, topping off both saddle tanks for a total of 200 gallons. That should have given him approximately 1,200 miles of range, maybe a bit more if he was lucky with tailwinds. By Marcus's calculations, he should have needed fuel around Oakley, Kansas after traveling roughly 1,000 miles. But when he passed through Oakley at 3:47 a.m. on November 1st, his fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full. That was impossible. He'd been driving for nearly 10 hours at highway speed, pulling a full load of agricultural equipment. He should have burned at least 160 gallons. Marcus tapped the fuel gauge, wondering if it was stuck. But the needle responded to his touch, bobbing slightly before settling back at the 3/4 mark. His Kenworth T680's instruments were relatively new and had never given him trouble before. The truck was running perfectly, engine temperature normal, no warning lights, smooth power delivery. Must be reading wrong, Marcus muttered, though a part of him knew that fuel gauges didn't malfunction by showing more fuel than actually existed. They failed by showing less or by dropping to empty suddenly. They didn't maintain a stable reading that contradicted basic physics. He continued driving, watching the gauge obsessively now. Mile after mile rolled by and the needle didn't move. It stayed locked at 3/4 full, defying everything Marcus knew about diesel consumption and fuel tank capacity. By the time he reached Salina, Kansas at 6:15 a.m., he traveled over 500 miles from Denver. The gauge still showed 3/4 full. Marcus pulled into a truck stop, his mind spinning with confused calculations. He backed into a parking space and shut off the engine, then climbed down and walked to the truck's fuel tanks. He opened the first cap and shone his flashlight into the tank. Diesel gleamed back at him, the level high enough to confirm the gauge's reading. He checked the second tank, equally full. Marcus stood there in the early morning light, staring at his fuel tanks, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Two possibilities occurred to him. Either his memory was wrong about filling up in Denver, or something impossible was happening to his fuel. He pulled out his phone and checked his credit card statement. There it was, a charge from Love S in Denver for $412, exactly what he'd expect for a full fill-up. So his memory was correct, which meant his fuel wasn't depleting normally. Marcus walked inside the truck stop and bought coffee, using the time to think. Maybe there was a rational explanation he wasn't seeing. Maybe the truck's computer was misreporting fuel consumption. Maybe the gauge was broken in some bizarre way that made it appear functional. Maybe he was so tired that he'd miscalculated the distance he'd traveled. But when he returned to his truck and checked the odometer, the numbers were clear. He'd covered 537 miles since Denver. At his normal fuel economy, he should have burned around 85 gallons. His tanks should be showing less than 60% full, not 75%. Marcus pulled up his truck's onboard diagnostics on the dashboard display. Fuel consumption, according to the computer, was normal. But the remaining fuel quantity didn't correlate with that consumption. The numbers contradicted each other in ways that made Marcus's head hurt. He sat in his cab, drinking coffee and trying to decide what to do. Report the problem to his mechanic. But what would he say? That his truck was somehow creating fuel? That made him sound insane. Keep driving and see what happened. That felt dangerous somehow, though Marcus couldn't articulate why. Finally, he decided to continue to his destination in Kansas City and deal with the mystery afterward. Maybe the gauge would correct itself. Maybe he'd figure out a rational explanation. He pulled back onto I-70 and resumed his journey east. The fuel gauge didn't change. Mile after mile, hour after hour, it remained frozen at 3/4 full. Marcus's anxiety grew with each passing hour. This wasn't a simple malfunction. This was something profoundly wrong with how his truck, or reality itself, was operating. He arrived at the agricultural equipment distributor in Kansas City at 1:30 p.m., having traveled nearly 900 miles from Denver. The fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full. After unloading his cargo, Marcus drove to a nearby truck stop and requested a complete diagnostic check. The mechanic ran every test available: fuel system pressure, tank level sensors, computer diagnostics, even manually dipping the tanks to measure fuel level by hand. Everything checked out perfectly. The truck was operating normally and the fuel tanks were indeed 3/4 full, just as the gauge indicated. "I don't see any problems," the mechanic said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Your truck's in great shape. Why did you think something was wrong?" Marcus hesitated. I feel like I should have used more fuel than this, given how far I've driven." The mechanic shrugged. "Maybe you got better fuel economy than usual. Tailwinds, good traffic flow, efficient driving. It happens sometimes." Marcus didn't argue, but he knew the numbers didn't support that explanation. Even with perfect conditions, he couldn't have covered 900 miles while burning only 50 gallons. That would require 14.4 miles per gallon, more than double his truck's actual efficiency. He left the shop and picked up his next load, manufactured goods, heading to St. Louis. The route was only 250 miles, an easy afternoon drive. Marcus kept his eyes locked on the fuel gauge as he traveled, watching for any change. The needle didn't move. He arrived in St. Louis with the gauge still showing 3/4 full. Over 1,100 miles from Denver, and his fuel level hadn't budged a single percentage point. Marcus sat in his parked truck outside the warehouse, his hands shaking slightly as they gripped the steering wheel. Something was very wrong. This wasn't a mechanical failure or a gauge malfunction. This was an impossibility, a violation of conservation of energy, a thing that couldn't happen in any rational universe. Marcus grabbed his CB radio. "This is the Blue Kenworth on Channel 19. Any drivers out there experience anything weird with their fuel consumption lately?" Static answered him for a few seconds, then a woman's voice. "Define weird." "I once had a fuel pump that kept running after I pulled the trigger. That weird enough?" "No, I mean like your fuel not depleting even though you're driving hundreds of miles." A different voice, male and amused. "Buddy, if you figured out how to make fuel last forever, you better patent that before the oil companies find out." Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't explain it in a way that wouldn't make him sound crazy. He signed off and sat in silence, thinking. That night, parked at a rest area outside St. Louis, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept getting out of his cab to check the fuel tanks, shining his flashlight into them, seeing diesel that shouldn't still be there. He calculated and recalculated the numbers, trying to find an error in his math, but the conclusion was always the same. His truck was traveling on fuel that wasn't depleting. The next morning, Marcus's dispatcher called with another load, this one going all the way to Philadelphia. 26 hours of driving time, over 1,000 miles. Marcus accepted the assignment, partly because he needed the work, but mostly because he wanted to see how far this impossible situation would extend. He picked up the load in St. Louis and headed east on I-70, then transitioned to I-76 through the mountains of Pennsylvania. The fuel gauge remained at 3/4 full through every mile, every hill, every acceleration and deceleration. By the time Marcus reached Philadelphia 2 days later, he traveled over 2,300 miles from his fill-up in Denver. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. Marcus had burned, according to the laws of physics and engineering, approximately 365 gallons of diesel, but his 200-gallon tanks had only depleted 50 gallons. Fuel was being created somehow, or wasn't being consumed, or was existing in some state that defied normal rules. After delivering his load in Philadelphia, Marcus drove to a Freightliner dealership and explained his situation to the service department. They were skeptical at first, but when Marcus showed them his logs, his receipts, his GPS data proving the distances he'd traveled, they grew more interested. They kept his truck for 3 days, running every diagnostic test in their arsenal, even bringing in Cummins engine specialists to examine the diesel system. The result? Everything was perfectly normal. The fuel system had no leaks, no abnormalities, no modifications. The engine was burning fuel at the expected rate according to its sensors, but the fuel level in the tanks didn't correspond with that consumption. One of the senior mechanics, a man named Garcia who'd been working on trucks for 30 years, pulled Marcus aside. "I've seen something like this once before," he said quietly. "About 15 years ago. Driver came in with the same complaint, fuel that wasn't depleting normally. We couldn't figure it out either. Truck ran fine, no problems, but the fuel just lasted." "What happened?" Marcus asked. Garcia's expression grew troubled. "The driver kept using the truck, figured if it wasn't causing problems, why worry about it? He went about 6 months without needing to refuel. Then one day he called us from the side of I-80 in Nebraska. His truck had stopped dead, completely out of fuel. All of it, both tanks empty simultaneously. He just filled up 2 days before, only driven 300 miles. The truck took all the fuel he'd been saving all at once." Marcus felt cold. Like it was collecting a debt. That's what it felt like, yeah. Like whatever had been keeping his tanks full suddenly demanded payment for all those months of free miles. The driver sold his truck after that, wouldn't tell us any details beyond the basics. He looked scared, like he'd realized he'd been borrowing something he shouldn't have. Marcus left Philadelphia with a growing sense of dread. The fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full, and now he understood that this wasn't a gift or a mechanical quirk. It was a debt he was accumulating. Eventually, the bill would come due. He started refueling regularly anyway, topping off his tanks at every truck stop even though the gauge indicated he didn't need it. The pumps accepted the fuel normally, and Marcus could see the diesel flowing into his tanks, but the gauge reading never changed. No matter how much fuel he added, it stayed locked at 3/4 full. This continued for weeks. Marcus drove from Philadelphia to Atlanta to Dallas to Phoenix, covering thousands of miles, refueling constantly but never seeing the gauge drop. Other drivers at truck stops began to notice his unusual refueling pattern and commented on it. "You got a leak or something?" one driver asked, watching Marcus fill his tanks after traveling only 100 miles from the last stop. "Something like that," Marcus muttered, not wanting to explain. The debt grew heavier in Marcus's mind. He traveled over 8,000 miles from that initial fill-up in Denver, burning fuel that somehow wasn't depleting his tanks. But Garcia's story haunted him. The idea that eventually, all that borrowed fuel would be demanded back, all at once. It happened on December 20th, 2018, on I-40 in New Mexico. Marcus was driving through empty desert, hauling electronics from Albuquerque to Flagstaff. The fuel gauge had shown 3/4 full since Denver, nearly 2 months ago and 8,000 miles ago. Marcus had just passed through Grants, New Mexico, and was climbing into the high desert when the engine coughed. Not a mechanical cough. Marcus had heard enough engines to know their sounds, but something else. A shudder that ran through the entire truck, from the front bumper to the rear doors of the trailer. The gauge reading dropped instantly from 3/4 to 1/4, then to empty. The engine died. Marcus's Kenworth rolled to a stop on the shoulder of I-40, its diesel engine silent, its fuel completely exhausted. Marcus sat in shocked stillness, then climbed down and checked his tanks. Both were completely empty. He could see the bottom of the tanks when he shone his flashlight into them. Dry, as if they'd never held fuel at all. He called for a fuel delivery, explaining to the dispatcher that he'd run out despite believing he had plenty. When the fuel truck arrived an hour later, the driver pumped 50 gallons into Marcus's tanks, the minimum delivery. Marcus paid the fee, started his engine, and drove to the nearest truck stop. There, he filled up completely, pumping 198 gallons into his 200-gallon tanks. The final cost was $743. Marcus stared at the receipt, his hands shaking. $743, almost exactly double what he'd paid for that fill-up in Denver 2 months ago. The debt had been collected, all the fuel he'd borrowed, all the miles he'd driven on fuel that shouldn't have existed, demanded back in a single transaction. Marcus's fuel gauge returned to normal after that. It depleted predictably as he drove, dropping to 3/4, then half, then quarter, then empty according to normal fuel consumption rates. His truck's range returned to the expected 1,200 miles per fill-up. Everything operated exactly as it should, with no mysterious fuel that lasted forever. But Marcus never forgot those 2 months when the rules had bent for him, when his truck had run on fuel that defied physics. He told the story carefully to select other drivers late at night at rest stops, and he always ended with a warning. If it happens to you, get rid of the truck immediately. Don't wait for the debt to come due, because it will, and when it does, you'll pay back everything you borrowed all at once. Some drivers laughed it off. Others nodded slowly, their eyes distant, as if they'd experienced similar impossibilities. And a few reached out to touch their own fuel gauges unconsciously, perhaps wondering if their own trucks might one day start running on borrowed fuel, accumulating a debt that would eventually demand payment. Marcus still drives, still hauls freight across the country, but he tracks his fuel consumption obsessively now, checking his gauges constantly, refueling before he drops below half a tank. He never wants to see that needle frozen again, never wants to travel on fuel that shouldn't exist. Because he knows the truth. On the highways, there are no free rides. Everything gets paid back eventually with interest. Story 9. The Phantom Convoy. Lisa Chen had heard other truckers talk about phantom trucks, ghost vehicles that appeared on lonely highways at night, traveling alongside living drivers before vanishing without a trace. She'd always dismissed these stories as urban legends, products of fatigue and isolation. But on the night of April 7th, 2020, Lisa became part of a phantom convoy, and she learned that some ghost stories are real. She was traveling north on Highway 83 through the Dakotas, hauling farm equipment from Nebraska to North Dakota. The highway was empty at 11:30 p.m., cutting through flat prairie land where the only lights were distant farmhouses and the stars scattered across the black sky above. Lisa's Mac Anthem was the only vehicle visible in either direction. Then suddenly, she wasn't alone anymore. Headlights appeared in her driver's side mirror, another truck coming up behind her in the left lane. Lisa glanced at the mirror, expecting the truck to pass, but instead, It settled into position beside her, matching her speed exactly. She couldn't see the truck clearly in the darkness, just the glow of its running lights and the silhouette of its cab. A minute later, another truck appeared ahead of her, emerging from the darkness as if it had materialized out of nothing. It was traveling at the same speed Lisa was maintaining, exactly 65 miles per hour, and it stayed at a fixed distance in front of her, neither pulling away nor falling back. Then a fourth truck appeared in her passenger mirror, taking position on her right side. Lisa found herself boxed in by 3 other trucks, all maintaining perfect formation around her. Front, left, and right, they held their positions with mathematical precision, creating a convoy that moved as a single unit through the night. Lisa grabbed her CB radio, switching to channel 19. "Hey, convoy around me on Highway 83. You guys got your ears on. This is the red Mac in the middle." Static answered her. She tried channel 17, then 21, cycling through the frequencies, but found only silence. The other trucks remained in formation, close enough that she should have been able to see the drivers in their cabs, but the windows were dark or perhaps simply empty. A prickle of fear ran down Lisa's spine. She eased off the accelerator slightly, dropping her speed to 60 miles per hour, expecting the convoy to continue at 65 and leave her behind. But the other trucks slowed with her, maintaining their exact positions relative to her truck. Lisa accelerated back to 65. The phantom trucks matched her speed instantly. She tried accelerating to 70. The convoy stayed with her, their positions unchanged. "What do you want?" Lisa shouted, though she knew no one could hear her. "Why are you following me?" The trucks offered no response, just continued their silent escort through the darkness. Lisa could feel her heart pounding. She considered slamming on the brakes or veering onto the shoulder, anything to break free from this formation, but fear held her in place. What if these phantom trucks reacted violently? What if she caused an accident trying to escape? So she kept driving, locked in convoy with the ghost trucks, traveling through the Dakota night at exactly 65 miles per hour. After 20 minutes, Lisa noticed something else. The landscape was repeating. She passed a distinctive red barn set back from the highway, its paint peeling in a pattern she registered subconsciously. 5 minutes later, she passed the same barn again. Same location relative to the highway, same peeling paint pattern, same angle of the roof. They were traveling in a loop. The convoy was covering ground. Lisa's odometer was ticking upward normally, but somehow they were passing through the same section of highway over and over. Lisa felt tears of frustration and fear welling up. "Let me go," she whispered. "Please, just let me go." The truck in front of her flashed its brake lights once, then twice, then 3 times. A signal. Lisa didn't know what it meant, but she understood it was communication of some kind. She flashed her own lights in response, not knowing what else to do. The landscape stopped repeating. The red barn didn't appear again. Whatever loop they'd been caught in had released them, and they were traveling through normal space again, or at least, space that moved forward rather than cycling back on itself. The phantom trucks maintained their formation for another hour. Lisa stopped trying to escape and simply drove, accepting this strange escort as she would accept any other inexplicable road condition. She watched the mile markers pass, tracked her progress north, and tried to ignore the impossible vehicles surrounding her. At 1:47 a.m., the truck in front of her began to slow down. Not dramatically, just a gradual reduction in speed from 65 to 60 to 55. Lisa slowed with it, and the trucks on her sides matched the deceleration. They brought the convoy down to 45 miles per hour, then to 30, then to a complete stop in the middle of Highway 83. Lisa sat in her idling truck, surrounded by the phantom convoy, all 4 vehicles motionless on the empty highway. She didn't know what to do. Wait, run, try to communicate again. Then she saw the lights ahead. They came over the horizon, high beam headlights on a vehicle traveling south at tremendous speed. Lisa couldn't tell what kind of vehicle it was. It was moving too fast and erratically, weaving between lanes. As it approached, Lisa realized with horror that it was traveling in her lane, the northbound lane, heading directly toward the convoy. The southbound vehicle, Lisa could see now it was a pickup truck, showed no signs of slowing or correcting its trajectory. It was barreling straight toward them at what had to be over 100 miles per hour. Lisa's hand moved to her horn, about to blast a warning, when the pickup truck reached the convoy. It passed through, not around, not between the stopped trucks, through them. The pickup traveled through the phantom truck in front of Lisa as if it wasn't there, as if it was made of smoke or projection rather than steel and rubber. The drunk or sleeping driver behind the pickup's wheel had no idea how close they'd come to a catastrophic collision. The pickup continued south, its taillights receding into the distance, its driver oblivious to the death they'd narrowly avoided. Lisa understood then. The phantom convoy hadn't been escorting her. It had been protecting her, guiding her through a stretch of highway where something terrible was going to happen, keeping her at a specific speed and position so she'd be stopped when that wrong-way driver came screaming through. If Lisa had been traveling at her normal speed, she would have been in the exact position where the pickup passed through, and the collision would have been horrific. The phantom trucks had saved her life. Tears flowed freely down Lisa's face now, not from fear but from overwhelming emotion. The trucks around her began to fade, their lights growing dimmer, their forms becoming translucent. Within seconds, they had vanished completely, leaving Lisa alone on the highway once again. She sat there for several minutes, catching her breath, wiping her eyes. Then she put her truck in gear and continued north, resuming her journey at normal speed. Highway 83 stretched ahead, empty and ordinary, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. Lisa pulled into a rest area 30 miles later and checked the news on her phone. She found a report of a major accident on Highway 83 south of her current position. A pickup truck had flipped and rolled after the driver fell asleep at the wheel. The driver survived with minor injuries, but the accident had occurred at exactly 1:47 a.m., the same time the phantom convoy had stopped Lisa. If she'd been traveling through that section at her normal speed, she would have been in the accident zone. The pickup would have hit her head-on instead of flipping solo. Both drivers would likely have died. Lisa spent the rest of that night researching phantom convoys. She found scattered reports going back decades, truckers describing ghost vehicles that appeared during dangerous conditions, escorted living drivers through hazards, then vanished without explanation. Some people theorized they were the spirits of truckers killed in accidents, still working their routes, still trying to help their fellow drivers stay safe. Others suggested they were some kind of highway angels, guardian entities that manifested when needed. Lisa didn't know what to believe, but she knew what she'd experienced. The phantom trucks had been real, real enough to hold position around her, real enough to guide her, real enough to stop her at exactly the right moment to avoid disaster. She continued trucking after that night, but she paid more attention to the stories other drivers told. When someone mentioned seeing ghost trucks or experiencing strange escorts on lonely highways, Lisa listened carefully instead of dismissing them. Because she knew the truth now. The highways were haunted, but not by malevolent spirits. They were watched over by something that cared, something that tried to protect the living from the dangers that lurked on dark roads. Sometimes, late at night when she's driving through empty country, Lisa catches glimpses of running lights in her mirrors or sees headlights that appear and disappear without explanation. She doesn't fear them anymore. Instead, she whispers a quiet thank you to the phantom convoy that saved her life, to the ghost truckers who still work the roads, and to whatever force keeps watch over drivers in the darkness. And whenever she sees a driver in trouble, a vehicle stopped on the shoulder, a truck weaving with fatigue, a car driving erratically, Lisa does what she can to help. She calls authorities, offers assistance, flashes warnings to other drivers. Because that's what the Phantom convoy taught her. We're all in this together, the living and the dead, all of us trying to make it safely to our destinations. All of us part of the same eternal convoy that travels the highways between life and whatever comes after. Story 10. The radio that predicted the future. Daniel Park had installed the CB radio himself in his new Volvo VNL in January 2022. It was a high-end Cobra model with all the features: noise cancellation, automatic squelch, weather channels, and crystal-clear reception. For the first 3 months, it worked perfectly. Daniel used it to communicate with other truckers, get traffic updates, and pass the long hours on the road with friendly chatter. Then, on March 18, 2022, the radio started predicting the future. Daniel was traveling east on I-70 through Kansas, hauling auto parts from Denver to St. Louis. It was 2:30 p.m. and the highway was moderately busy with afternoon traffic. His CB radio crackled with the usual transmissions, truckers discussing routes, warning about speed traps, complaining about construction zones. Then a new voice came through, clear and urgent. All eastbound traffic on I-70. There's a major accident at mile marker 247. Multi-vehicle pileup, road completely blocked. You need to take exit 245 and use the alternate route through Oakley. Daniel frowned. He was currently at mile marker 233, about 14 miles west of the reported accident. He grabbed his phone and checked Waze and Google Maps, but neither showed any accident ahead. Traffic appeared normal all the way through to the Kansas-Missouri border. "Did anyone else hear that accident report?" Daniel asked over the CB. "At mile marker 247, a woman's voice responded. "I'm at marker 251 heading west and I'm not seeing any accident. Traffic's flowing normally." Daniel felt a chill. The voice had been so specific, so urgent, but there was no accident. He continued driving, keeping alert for any signs of trouble ahead. He passed exit 245, the one the voice had told him to take, and kept going. Mile marker 247 approached. Daniel's hands tensed on the wheel, ready for brake lights and emergency vehicles. But there was nothing. Traffic flowed smoothly. No accident, no pileup, no blocked road. "False alarm, I guess," Daniel muttered, relaxing slightly. 30 seconds later, a pickup truck in the left lane suddenly swerved to avoid debris in the road. Daniel caught a glimpse of a shredded tire, probably from a semi. The pickup overcorrected, fishtailed wildly, and slammed into the center barrier. The car behind the pickup couldn't stop in time and rear-ended it. Within seconds, vehicles were braking and swerving across all lanes as the accident cascaded backward through traffic. Daniel reacted instantly, having been primed by the earlier warning. He hit his brakes hard, activating his Jake brake and air brakes simultaneously, bringing his loaded truck to a controlled stop just yards from the collision. Other vehicles weren't so lucky. 3 more cars piled into each other before the chain reaction ended. The accident occurred exactly at mile marker 247, exactly where the voice had predicted. But the warning had come 20 minutes before the accident happened. Daniel sat in his stopped truck, hands shaking, watching emergency responders arrive. The accident was serious but not catastrophic. Several injuries, no fatalities, vehicles damaged but not destroyed. If Daniel had taken exit 245 like the voice suggested, he would have avoided it entirely. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that the warning had preceded the accident by 20 minutes. The voice had described something that hadn't happened yet, as if reporting on events from the future. Daniel tried to tell himself he'd misunderstood, that maybe the warning had been about a different accident or a prediction based on hazardous conditions. But the specificity was undeniable. Mile marker 247, multi-vehicle pileup, road completely blocked. All of those details had come true, just not until 20 minutes after the warning. Traffic was stuck for over an hour while crews cleared the accident and treated the injured. Daniel used the time to think about his radio, about that impossible warning, about what it might mean. When traffic finally resumed, Daniel continued east. His CB radio carried normal chatter for the rest of the afternoon. Nothing unusual, nothing predictive. He tried to put the incident out of his mind, chalking it up to bizarre coincidence. But it happened again the next day. Daniel was traveling south on I-35 through Minnesota, approaching the Twin Cities. At 9:15 a.m., a voice came over the CB. Southbound traffic on I-35, there's a vehicle fire at mile marker 112. Right lane blocked, heavy smoke, slow down and use caution. Daniel checked his location, mile marker 118, about 6 miles north of the reported fire. He switched lanes to the left, preparing to pass the incident, and watched for smoke ahead. There was nothing. Clear skies, normal traffic, no smoke or fire visible. Daniel passed mile marker 112 at 9:23 a.m. with no issues. No fire, no blocked lane, no reason for the warning. 8 minutes later at 9:31 a.m., a pickup truck in the right lane suddenly pulled onto the shoulder, smoke pouring from under its hood. Within seconds, flames erupted from the engine compartment. The driver jumped out and ran away from the vehicle as the fire intensified. Traffic slowed dramatically as drivers gawked at the burning truck. The fire occurred exactly at mile marker 112, exactly as the voice had predicted. But the warning had come 16 minutes before the fire started. Daniel pulled into a rest area and sat in his truck, trying to make sense of what was happening. His CB radio was receiving warnings from the future, not minutes or hours ahead, but just enough time for drivers to prepare or avoid the incidents. Someone or something was broadcasting these warnings through his radio, giving him advance notice of accidents and hazards. But why and how? CB radios transmitted and received radio waves at specific frequencies. They couldn't access information from the future. They couldn't predict events that hadn't happened yet. This violated causality, violated everything Daniel understood about how time and communication worked. He examined his radio carefully, looking for any modifications or unusual components. Everything appeared normal, standard circuitry, proper antenna connection, no weird additions that might explain the future warnings. Daniel had installed it himself and knew every component. Over the following weeks, the warnings continued. Daniel's radio would broadcast specific information about incidents ahead, accidents, weather events, road hazards, traffic backups, always 15 to 30 minutes before they actually occurred. And the warnings were never wrong. Every single prediction came true exactly as described. Daniel began to rely on the warnings, taking the suggested exits and alternate routes, avoiding the incidents entirely. His driving became eerily safe. He never encountered accidents, never got caught in unexpected traffic, never faced hazards that other drivers struggled with. It was as if he could see the future of the highway and navigate around its dangers. But the warnings came with a cost. Daniel began to notice that other drivers weren't hearing the same warnings. When the voice announced incidents over his CB, Daniel would call out on the same channel, asking if anyone else had heard the warning. The responses were always confused. Other drivers heard only Daniel's voice, not the original warning. The future predicting transmissions were coming through Daniel's radio alone. No one else could hear them. This realization terrified Daniel more than the impossible nature of the warnings themselves. If only his radio received these messages, that meant they were directed specifically at him. Someone or something had singled out his equipment, his journey, for these mysterious interventions. Daniel tried replacing the radio. He bought a new Cobra unit, identical to his first one, and installed it carefully. For 2 days, the warnings stopped, and Daniel felt relieved. Maybe the problem had been a malfunction in the original unit, some weird defect that created the illusion of future warnings. Then the new radio started broadcasting the predictions. Same voice, same specific warnings, same 20-minute advance notice of incidents. The problem hadn't been the hardware. The problem, or whatever this was, followed Daniel himself, not his equipment. He consulted with other truckers, carefully describing his experience without sounding too crazy. Most looked at him skeptically, but an older driver named Frank pulled him aside and spoke quietly. "I knew a guy who had something similar happen. Radio that gave him warnings before things occurred. He drove for 3 years with it, never had a single accident, never got caught in bad weather." Then one day the warning stopped. "What happened?" Daniel asked. Frank's expression grew dark. "The next week he died in a multi-car pileup on I-40, the one accident he didn't get warned about." Daniel felt cold terror settle into his chest. "Are you saying the warnings will eventually stop? And when they do?" "I'm saying nothing comes for free, especially not help from sources we don't understand. If something's keeping you safe, it might be for a reason. And that reason might not be for your benefit in the end." Daniel returned to his truck and examined his situation logically. The warnings had kept him safe for months now, preventing him from being involved in dozens of accidents and incidents. But what if Frank was right? What if these warnings were building towards something, saving him for some specific future event? He considered destroying his radio entirely, throwing it away and refusing to install a new one. But the warnings had saved other drivers too. When Daniel heeded the warnings and avoided incidents, other truckers benefited from his changed route, from his absence in situations that might have been worse with his truck involved. So Daniel kept the radio and continued driving. The warnings persisted, sometimes multiple per day, sometimes none for a week, but always accurate, always specific, always giving him just enough advance notice to avoid the danger. He documented everything in a journal: dates, times, exact warnings, and the eventual incidents they predicted. The data was meticulous, providing clear evidence that the warnings preceded the events by measurable time intervals. Daniel didn't know what he'd do with this documentation, but he felt compelled to record it. Months passed. Daniel became the safest driver in his company's fleet. 0 accidents, 0 violations, 0 insurance claims. His managers praised his caution and skill, not knowing that he had help from an impossible source. Then on September 22, 2022, the warnings changed. Daniel was traveling west on I-80 through Nebraska when the voice came through his CB at 3:45 p.m. "Daniel, park in the white Volvo. Exit at Kearney. Do not continue west on I-80. Exit at Kearney and take Highway 44 south." Daniel nearly drove off the road in shock. The voice had used his name. All the previous warnings had been generic, addressing all drivers or all traffic in a certain area. But this warning was personal, directed specifically at him. "Who is this?" Daniel demanded over the CB. "How do you know my name?" No response. Just silence on the channel. The exit for Kearney was 10 miles ahead. Daniel had a load scheduled for delivery in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Highway 44 south would take him completely off route, adding hours to his journey. But every warning had been accurate so far. Every prediction had come true. Daniel took the exit. He followed Highway 44 south into the empty Nebraska farmland, checking his GPS obsessively, wondering what disaster he was avoiding on I-80. He searched news sites on his phone, looking for any reports of accidents or closures, but found nothing. 20 minutes after Daniel exited, his phone lit up with an emergency alert. Major accident on I-80 westbound near Lexington, Nebraska. Multiple fatalities. Road closed indefinitely. Daniel pulled over and checked the details. A truck hauling chemicals had jackknifed and caught fire, igniting a massive explosion that engulfed multiple vehicles. 7 people died instantly. The highway remained closed for 18 hours while hazmat crews cleaned up the site. If Daniel had continued on I-80, he would have been in the center of that explosion. The radio had saved his life by name, directing him personally off the route that would have killed him. Daniel sat on the shoulder of Highway 44, crying with relief and terror. The warnings weren't random. They were personal. Something was watching him specifically, protecting him specifically, for reasons he still didn't understand. He never received another named warning. The predictions continued in their generic form. Warnings about accidents and hazards that other drivers couldn't hear, delivered through his CB radio 20 minutes before they occurred. Daniel followed them all, trusting the impossible voice that had saved his life multiple times. He still drives today, still receives the warnings, still documents them in his journal. He doesn't know what's on the other end of those transmissions: ghost truckers, time-traveling communications, guardian angels, or something entirely beyond human understanding. He only knows that his CB radio connects him to information from the future, and that information has kept him alive. Other truckers have noticed that Daniel Park never has accidents, never gets caught in bad situations, always seems to be in the right place at the right time. Some call him lucky. Others whisper that he's been touched by something from the other side. Daniel doesn't correct either interpretation. He just keeps driving, keeps listening to his radio, and keeps following the warnings that come from somewhere beyond normal time and space. And sometimes, late at night when the highways are empty and the stars shine bright overhead, Daniel speaks into his CB microphone. "Thank you. Whoever or whatever you are, thank you for keeping me safe." He never gets a response, but he swears the static sounds different after he says it, warmer somehow, like acknowledgement from a source that can't or won't speak directly. The radio continues to predict the future, one warning at a time, keeping Daniel Park safe on his endless journey across America's highways.